The morning Vivian Harcourt walked into the Coldwater County General Store and announced loud enough for every ear in the room that Silas Boone had finally lost his mind. She made sure every woman in town heard exactly why. He sent for a mail-order bride, Vivian said, setting her gloves on the counter with the deliberate care of a woman accustomed to being watched. And when I say he got what he paid for, well, she let the pause do the cruelty for her. Let's just say the poor man must have been desperate. The laughter was quiet, the kind that doesn't commit to anything out loud. Nobody asked Mabel Hart what she thought. Nobody ever did. If you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye measure you before you'd spoken a single word, if you've ever known the particular exhaustion of being judged before you were given a chance, then you already understand something about Mabel Hart that most people in Coldwater County never bothered to learn. She was 28 years old. She had rough hands, a broad back, and a body that frontier society had spent years deciding wasn't worthy of admiration. She had worked since she was 11. She had buried a father, held together a family, and answered a newspaper advertisement, not because she was desperate for a husband, but because her family needed money and she had run out of other options. She wasn't looking for a love story. She was looking for a way through. Before you find out whether she got one, if this is the kind of story that stays with you, kind that makes you think about the women who were written off before they ever got started, subscribe to this channel and follow Mabel's story all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. The train arrived in Coldwater on a Tuesday morning in April, when the prairie wind was still cold enough to cut through wool, and the mud on the main street had not yet decided whether it was winter or spring. Mabel stepped off the platform carrying a single canvas bag and a small wooden trunk that had belonged to her mother. She wore a brown dress that had been washed too many times, and a coat that fit well enough in the shoulders but pulled across the back when she moved. She had no hat worth mentioning. She had 43 cents in her coat pocket, and a letter from Silas Boone in her bag that she had read so many times the fold lines were starting to give. Rancher seeking a wife must cook for 20 hands. Inquire care of Coldwater Post. It wasn't much of a letter. It wasn't much of an invitation. But Mabel had written back, stated her experience plainly, and received a response within 2 weeks. Silas Boone had not described himself, had not made promises, had not painted any picture of what she was walking into. He had simply confirmed the arrangement and told her the train fare would be waiting at the Omaha station. She had taken the fare and boarded the train with the particular stillness of a woman who has made peace with an uncertain decision. The town of Coldwater was not large. It had a general store, a post office, a livery, 2 saloons, a church she did not intend to visit, and enough people standing around, watching the train arrive, that Mabel understood she was going to be noticed whether she wanted to be or not. She was noticed. She heard the silence first, the particular pause in conversation that happens when something unexpected appears. Then she heard the whispers, and while she couldn't catch every word, she'd heard enough versions of the same thing in enough towns to understand the shape of what was being said. Kept walking. A ranch hand named Denny Alcott was waiting near the livery with a wagon and an expressions that tried very hard to be neutral and didn't quite manage it. He was young, maybe 20, with sunburned ears and the look of a man who'd been told to do a job and intended to do it without getting involved. "Miss Hart," he said, "that's right. I'm to take you to the Boone Ranch." He looked at her trunk, looked at her, looked at the trunk again. "That everything?" "That's everything." He loaded the trunk without another word. Mabel climbed up onto the wagon bench herself, without waiting for help, and settled her bag across her knees. The drive from town to the Boone Ranch took 40 minutes across open prairie road, and Denny Alcott spent most of it staring at the horizon with the focused intensity of a man determined not to make conversation. Mabel didn't push. She watched the land instead, the way the grass was just beginning to show green at the roots, the way the sky out here was a different kind of enormous than the sky back home in Missouri, pressing down on everything, with a weight that felt personal. She thought about her mother's kitchen, about the smell of it in winter wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular warmth of a stove that was never fully out. She thought about the letter she'd left for her brother Thomas, and the money she'd agreed to send once she was settled, and the fact that settled was a word she'd never been entirely sure she understood. The ranch appeared over a low rise. It was larger than she'd expected. The main house was 2 stories, solidly built, the kind of structure that had gone up when there was still real money and real ambition behind it. There were outbuildings, a large barn, a bunkhouse, 2 smaller structures she couldn't identify yet. Fencing stretched in every direction, newer in some places than others, and the yard between the house and the barn showed the wear of heavy use. It was also, she noticed as they came closer, not a happy-looking place. There was a specific quality to a property that had been maintained without being cared for, where things got fixed when they broke, and left alone otherwise, where the work got done, but the life had gone out of it. She'd seen that quality before in the faces of men who had lost something they didn't know how to replace. She saw it now in the Boone ranch. The wagon stopped near the front porch. Mabel climbed down before Denny could decide whether to offer a hand. The front door opened. Silas Boone was not what she had imagined. She had pictured someone older, more weathered, someone who wore his money the way certain men did loudly, in the quality of his coat or the size of his belt buckle. Silas was none of that. He was perhaps 35, lean through the shoulders in a way that spoke of work rather than idleness, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had spent decades in weather without complaining about it. He had the eyes of a man who assessed things carefully and concluded quietly. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and in that moment Mabel did the calculation she had learned to do fast. Was this going to be a man who was disappointed, who was angry, who was going to pretend everything was fine while clearly thinking it was not? She had braced herself for all three. What she got instead was Silas Boone, saying with no particular inflection, "Miss Hart, you must be tired. Come inside." That was it. No visible flinch. No labored politeness. Just an invitation into his house, stated plainly, as if her arriving was simply the next thing that needed to happen. She followed him inside. The front room was clean enough orderly, in the way of a space that was used functionally, and nothing more. No softness in it, no sign that anyone had sat down in it recently for any reason except necessity. There were good pieces of furniture, quality things from when the house was first built, now carrying the slightly abandoned look of objects that had outlasted their original purpose. Silas led her straight through to the kitchen. She stopped in the doorway. The smell hit her first something between rancid fat and old ash, layered over a deeper rot that she recognized as wood that had been wet and dried too many times without proper treatment. Then she took in the room itself. The shelf along the east wall had partially collapsed, pulling the bracket from the log wall and leaving the boards hanging at an angle. Whatever had been on that shelf, she could see cans, jars, a sack of something, had been shoved onto the work table in a pile that nobody had sorted. The stove was coated in a season's worth of built-up grease, the kind of accumulation that happened when someone cleaned it only when they had to, and sometimes not even then. The window above the work table had a crack running from the upper left corner to the center, covered on the inside with a strip of oilcloth that had been nailed rather than sealed, so cold air came through around the edges. The work table salvageable heavy pine, good construction, but someone had let moisture sit on it long enough that the near end was starting to show rot. The floor was swept. She gave it that. But the floor was the only thing that suggested anyone had tried. Silas stood beside her, waiting. She could feel him waiting, not anxiously, not defensively, but in the manner of a man who understood that something had to be said, and was prepared to hear it. 20 men eat out of this kitchen, Mabel said, every day. She walked to the shelf and tested the remaining bracket with her hand. It shifted in the wall, the wood around the nails soft with rot. She pressed on the work table near the damaged end and felt the give. She opened the stove door and looked inside, where the firebox walls were coated with a layer of residue thick enough to affect the draft. She went to the window and pressed her fingers against the oilcloth and felt the air moving around the edges. Then she turned around. "I won't cook in this kitchen." Silas's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. "The men need to eat. I understand that, and they will." She looked at him steadily. "But not until this room is fit to work in. That shelf needs to come down and be rebuilt from sound wood. Stove needs a full cleaning, inside and out, before it's lit again. That window needs to be properly glazed, or at minimum sealed with something that actually keeps the weather out. And this work table," she pressed the soft end again, "needs the rotted section cut off and the leg rescorted, or the whole thing's going to collapse under a heavy pot and someone's going to get hurt." The silence in the room had a quality she recognized. It was the silence of someone deciding whether to be angry. Silas wasn't angry. He looked at the kitchen, at the shelf, at the window. He looked at her. "What do you need?" he said. "Lumber. Nails. A proper cleaning brush for the stovepipe. Glazing compound or proper sealing putty for the window. A week. A week. I can do it faster if I have help. But I need the materials today if I'm going to start tomorrow." Another silence, longer. "The men ate this morning," he said. "They'll need supper." "I can manage supper from what's here. with the stove as it is, if you give me 2 hours and keep everyone out of the kitchen while I work. But I'm telling you now, Silas, I won't set up a real kitchen in a space that's going to work against me every day." She paused. "That's not stubbornness. That's knowing what the job actually requires." He studied her for another moment. Then he nodded once. "I'll send Denny to town for the lumber," he said. "The nails and the glazing compound I have in the barn. I'll bring them to you." "Thank you." He left. Mabel stood alone in the ruined kitchen for a moment, listening to the sound of the wind around that cracked window. Then she set her bag down, took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and began deciding where to start. The 20 ranch hands who ate supper in the Boone bunkhouse that evening were not in general men who expected much from the world and were therefore rarely disappointed by it. They were cattlemen and wranglers and fencing crews, most of them hired seasonal and a few permanent, ranging in age from Denny Alcott's 20 years to the foreman Harlan Pike's weathered 50-something, and they had been surviving on the cooking of a rotation of increasingly indifferent arrangements since Silas's first wife died 3 years ago. They had been told a wife was coming. Most of them had reserved judgment. The supper Mabel produced from a kitchen she hadn't yet touched beans that had been properly seasoned and not merely boiled, cornbread that had a crust on it, pot of something she'd found the remains of and rebuilt into actual stew, arrived in the bunkhouse without announcement, and the men ate it in a silence that was, in its own way, a kind of praise. Harlan Pike, who had the face of a man assembled from leftover pieces that didn't quite fit together, mismatched brow and jaw, a nose that had been broken at least twice, ate his bowl without comment. He ate a second bowl. He did not say anything about the food. He said the next morning, to Silas, "She can cook." Coming from Harlan Pike, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. But Mabel wasn't thinking about the food yet. Not really. She was thinking about the kitchen, and the lumber Denny had brought back from town, and the sequence of repairs she'd mapped out in her head the night before, while lying in the small room off the kitchen that Silas had indicated, was hers a narrow space with a cot and a window that actually closed properly, which she appreciated. She started before dawn. The shelf came down first. Pulled the remaining boards free of the brackets, checked each one and sorted them into salvageable, and lost. Most were lost. The brackets themselves had been driven into log sections that were now soft from years of moisture seeping under the eaves. She could push her thumbnail into the wood around each nail hole, which meant the entire mounting surface needed to be replaced or reinforced. She spent the first morning cutting new bracket support blocks from the lumber Denny had brought, forcing the old nails out and cleaning the wall surface, then setting the new blocks with longer nails driven at opposing angles through solid wood. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway around mid-morning. He watched her for a while without saying anything. She was aware of him watching. She kept working. "You know carpentry," he said finally. "I know what needs doing and how to figure out the rest." She didn't look up from the block she was leveling. "My father built furniture when he wasn't farming. I handed him tools from the time I was 8. He teach you?" "He let me watch. I taught myself." She tested the block with the level again. "Watching is usually enough if you pay attention." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Can I help?" She looked at him then. It was not an offer she'd expected. In her experience, men either got out of the way of work they'd handed off to someone else, or they stood around offering corrections. Silas was asking if he could be useful. "Yes," she said. "Hold this bracket against the block while I set the first nail. I need a second pair of hands or the angle's going to be wrong." Came across the kitchen and held the bracket where she indicated. He drove the nail, then the second. She tested the result with her palm solid, no movement. "Good," she said. They worked side by side for an hour without much conversation. Mabel noticed that Silas did what he was asked, without adding his own opinion, and that when he didn't know where to position something, he said so directly instead of guessing. She appreciated both things more than she expected to. The shelf frame was rebuilt by noon. The boards went up in the afternoon, planed smooth along their edges where she'd trimmed the salvageable ones, new lumber where she hadn't. By the end of the first day, the east wall had a shelf system that was, if anything, more solid than the original had been. Denny Alcott brought her supper in the kitchen because she told him she'd eat while she worked. Stood in the doorway, looking at the new shelf, with an expression somewhere between surprise and confusion, as if the room had rearranged itself without his involvement, which was more or less exactly what had happened. "You built that," he said. "This afternoon." "Huh," he considered it. "That's better than the old one." "I know." He left. Mabel ate her supper standing at the work table and then turned her attention to the stove. The stove took 2 days. Not because it was complicated, but because it had been neglected so thoroughly that cleaning it was almost an archaeological process, layer by layer, working backward through seasons of use to find the actual metal underneath. She scraped the firebox walls with a tool she fashioned from a piece of strap iron, worked the flue brush through the entire chimney length, to grease the exterior with a solution of lye and water that she made herself from materials in the barn, and then seasoned the cast iron surfaces with a thin coat of lard rendered down and wiped on while the metal was warm. By the end of the second day, the stove was something a person could actually trust. The window was the most aggravating problem, because aggravating problems always are. Crack in the glass was structural. It ran from corner to center and had spread slightly along its length from the constant pressure of the oilcloth pulled tight against it. She couldn't repair the glass itself, but Silas produced, from somewhere in the barn, a spare pane that was close to the right size. Cut it down with a glass cutter she'd found in the toolbox, not a skill she'd used often, and she cut it wrong on the first try and had to start again with the remaining piece. The second attempt fit. She set it in glazing compound and nailed fresh stops around the frame. The window sealed. She stood at the work table and put her hand near the glass and felt nothing. No air, no cold seep, just the faint warmth of the midday sun coming through clean glass. Something tightened in her chest that she didn't quite name. The work table was the last repair, and in some ways the one she cared about most, because the work table was where everything happened in a kitchen, where dough got turned, where vegetables got cut, where the whole physical logic of a cook's day played out. The rotted section at the near end had gone soft through about 14 inches of length and was beginning to involve one of the supporting legs. She cut the rod out with a handsaw, scarfed in a new section of matching pine, and reglued and clamped the joint. The legs she reinforced with a diagonal brace cut from the remaining lumber, driving the fasteners into sound wood on both ends. She let the glue cure overnight. In the morning, she ran her hand along the full length of the table, all of it, corner to corner, and felt a surface that was solid and clean and ready. She stood in the kitchen then and looked at all of it. The new shelf, orderly and plumb. The stove, black and clean and radiating proper heat. The window sealed, the table whole. It had taken her 6 days. She had cooked every meal in between, regardless, not out of obligation, but because 20 men needed food, and she was not going to let them go hungry, because the kitchen wasn't ready yet. She had managed around the problems, rather than letting the problems manage her. But now there were no problems left to manage around. Now she could cook the way she actually knew how. She built the fire up in the stove and let it run for 10 minutes, watching the temperature, listening to the draft clean and strong, no pops or irregular draws. Then she started breakfast. The biscuits took 40 minutes from flour to table. She made them large, with butter worked into the dough rather than added after, and she'd found a proper cast iron pan on the shelf she'd reorganized that held the heat evenly. She made eggs 3 ways, because she had enough to do it, and she wanted to see what she was working with. She rendered the bacon low and slow so the fat ran out before the meat scorched. She made gravy from the drippings with a proper roux. No lumps, seasoned aggressively, 'cause ranch hands eat before dawn, and their palates need waking up. Carried it all to the bunkhouse, in 2 trips. The men were already at their benches. Harlan Pike was at the end of the table with his coffee cup, reading the room, the way foremen read rooms, cataloging everything, approving or disapproving without announcing either. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at the eggs. He looked at the gravy. Picked up his fork. The table was quiet in a way that wasn't its usual pre-dawn vacancy. It was the quiet of 20 men tasting something and not wanting to interrupt what was happening in their mouths with unnecessary words. Denny Alcott said, under his breath, to no one in particular, Lord Almighty. Harlan Pike did not say anything for the entire meal. When it was over, he brought his plate back to the kitchen himself, which Mabel later learned he had never done in 3 years, and set it on the table. Good biscuits, he said. Then he left. Silas came in while she was washing up, poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, and stood at the work table, and she noticed him run his hand along the surface, the way she had checking it, feeling the solidity. How's the repair holding? She asked without turning around. Feels solid. He was quiet for a moment. You fixed it everything. I said I would. You said a week. It's been 6 days. 6 days is less than a week. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it in his reflection in the clean window glass and filed it away. The men were talking at breakfast, he said. Were they? About the biscuits. He paused. Also about the shelf. The shelf is sturdier than anything else in this kitchen. I know, he set his coffee cup down. I looked at it this morning. The bracket work is better than what the original carpenter did. Mabel rinsed the last pot and set it to dry. I take the work seriously. I can see that. He was quiet for another moment, and in that quiet she heard something she wasn't sure what to do with, a quality of consideration, of a man recalibrating something he thought he understood. I appreciated the help with the brackets, he said finally. The first morning. You were useful, she said. Not everyone is. She didn't say it as a compliment exactly. It was just the truth. But he received it as if it were one, and when he left the kitchen a few minutes later, there was something slightly different in the way he moved through the door, less like a man exiting a room he'd wandered into by accident, and more like a man leaving a place he'd been invited to. Mabel noticed. She also noticed that she'd noticed, and told herself firmly that noticing was as far as it went. Kitchen changed the ranch in ways that were not immediately visible, but were absolutely real. It started with the meals, which were simply better than anything the men had eaten in 3 years, and which arrived consistently on time, without the particular quiet desperation of food produced by someone who was managing rather than cooking. But it spread from there in ways that had nothing to do with food. The ranch hands started coming to the kitchen for reasons that weren't meals. One of them, a man named Burl, big through the chest and shoulders and remarkably gentle in his hands, started appearing in the mornings before breakfast to carry wood for her. She hadn't asked him. He'd just started. When she asked him about it, he shrugged and said the woodpile was closer to the kitchen than to the bunkhouse. And it made sense. She understood this was the kind of help that men on ranches offered when they respected you but didn't know how to say so. She accepted it without making it significant. Denny Alcott took to sweeping the kitchen porch without being asked, which she also didn't comment on. Harlan Pike, who was not a man given to conversation, began stopping at the kitchen door in the late mornings with questions about supplies. What did she need? What was running low? What should he pick up in town on the next run? Questions were practical, and he kept them brief. But he was asking her, which meant he had decided she was the right person to ask. And that decision meant something. The change in Silas was slower and harder to name. He had been, as far as she could tell from what little she'd seen and what less she'd been told, a man who had withdrawn from his own ranch after his first wife's death, not dramatically, not in any way that stopped the work from getting done, but in the way of someone who had removed himself just enough that the place felt like it was running without him rather than being run by him. He was present, but not quite there. In the second week after the kitchen was finished, he started fixing things. Fixed the porch steps. First 3 of them had cracked boards, and she'd noticed because she stepped carefully on them every morning taking food to the bunkhouse. Came out one morning to find him on his knees with a board and a hammer before the sun was properly up. He didn't say anything about it. He just fixed them. Then he replaced a section of fence near the house that had been leaning for what looked like months. Then he patched the roof of the smaller outbuilding. She'd heard rain come through it during a storm and mentioned it to Denny, not expecting anything, and 2 days later Silas was up there with roofing nails and tar paper. She didn't ask him about it. He didn't explain, but she noticed that he was in the kitchen more not during the busy cooking hours, but in the quiet in-between times, the mid-morning lull or the late afternoon before supper. He would come in for coffee and stay longer than it took to drink it. He would ask her practical questions at first, about the supplies, about what she'd found in the pantry that needed replacing, about whether the stove was drawing correctly. Then gradually, less practical things. He asked her once where she'd learned to make preserves. Another time he asked what Missouri had been like compared to this. She answered the questions without making more of them than they were. She was good at that, she thought. She had learned a long time ago not to build meaning from scraps, to take what was offered without adding what wasn't there. But somewhere around the 3rd week, she caught herself looking forward to the mid-morning quiet, caught herself arranging her work so that the task she was doing when Silas came in would be one she could talk through without stopping, so the conversation could go where it went. She filed that away without examining it too closely. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, which had not previously distinguished itself as a day given to trouble. Mabel was at the work table rolling pastry when she heard the wagon in the yard, not the working sound of a ranch wagon, but the particular sound of a vehicle that had been maintained to make an impression, clean roll of oiled wheels, and the high clear clip of a well-shod horse. She looked through the kitchen window and saw a woman descend from the wagon with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched descending from things. Vivian Harcourt was not ugly, and she knew it. She was perhaps 40, dressed in the kind of traveling outfit that was expensive enough to look simple, with dark hair arranged under a hat that probably cost more than Mabel's entire wardrobe. She had the particular confidence of a woman who had never had to wonder whether a room would arrange itself around her, because it always did. She walked to the front door and knocked, not waited at the door, knocked, with the authority of someone who expected an answer and expected it promptly. Silas was out on the range. Mabel heard the knock from the kitchen and dried her hands and went to answer it, because there was no one else. Vivian looked at her. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was the most comprehensive dismissal Mabel had ever received without words, a full inventory, head to foot, taking in the flour on her apron, and the rough hands, and everything else that was Mabel Hart, and reaching a conclusion that was visible even before Vivian had decided what to say. "I'm here to see Silas," Vivian said. "He's out. I expect him back before noon." Mabel stepped back from the door. "You're welcome to come in and wait." Another assessment. "And you are Mabel Boone," she said it plainly without emphasis. His wife. Something moved across Vivian's face. Not quite surprised, she'd clearly heard the news. Everyone had heard the news, but something more complicated than surprise. It resolved itself into the particular expression of a person who has decided that a situation is beneath them but must be dealt with anyway. Came inside. Mabel put coffee on, because that was what you did, and brought out what she'd baked that morning, nothing elaborate. Just shortbread she'd made to test a new batch of butter from the dairy and set it on the table in the front room. She left Vivian to it and went back to her pastry. Could hear Vivian from the kitchen. Not words exactly, but the quality of the silence, the way a person settled into a space they were evaluating, cataloging, forming opinions about. Silas came back at 11:30. She heard his boots on the newly repaired porch steps, and then the sound of Vivian's voice shifting register warmer, more careful, the voice of a woman turning something on. She stayed in the kitchen. Silas came to find her about 20 minutes later. She was crimping the edge of the pastry, and she did not stop. "Vivian Harcourt is here," he said, as if she didn't know. "I gathered." He was quiet for a moment. "She wants to stay for dinner." Mabel looked at him. "Then she'll stay for dinner." He looked at her in a way she couldn't read, something between gratitude and something else she didn't name, and then went back to the front room. Dinner was not a disaster. It was not comfortable either. Vivian sat at Silas's table and ate the food Mabel had made, and said several pleasant things about the countryside, and a few pointed things about the ranch, how she remembered it from before, how it had changed, how interesting this was to see it now. She did not speak directly to Mabel, except once near the end of the meal. "It's very kind of Silas to have someone to manage the kitchen," Vivian said. "To the table, to no one in particular. I'm sure it's a relief." Mabel set down her fork, picked it up again, took a breath that was shallow enough not to show. "I expect it is," she said. Vivian smiled, and Mabel understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has been underestimated her entire life, that the easy part was over. Vivian Harcourt came back. She came back the following Thursday with a friend, both of them ostensibly passing through on their way to a church meeting in the next county, a transparently thin excuse that Mabel did not comment on. Came back the Thursday after that, alone, and spent an hour with Silas in the front room, while Mabel was in the kitchen making bread. She was not, Mabel understood, simply visiting. She was establishing a pattern. She was inserting herself back into the rhythm of Silas's life, in the way that water inserts itself into cracks, not forcefully, but persistently, finding the places where there was give. Mabel watched this happening and said nothing about it to Silas. She had her reasons. She had not come to this ranch for a romance. She had come for work, for a way to help her family, for the kind of arrangement that was honest about what it was. She had not expected to feel anything complicated. She had not planned on the mid-morning conversations, or the way Silas handed her a tool before she asked for it, or the specific quality of his attention when she was talking, the way he listened as though what she was saying was the only thing happening in the room. She had not planned on any of it, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. What she knew, what she told herself firmly, on the evenings when Vivian's latest visit sat in her chest like a stone, was that she was not going to make claims she hadn't earned, was not going to assume a place in this man's life that hadn't been offered, was not going to allow herself to want something she wasn't sure she was allowed to want. She had been taught for most of her life that women who looked like her should be grateful, that an offer made was an offer to be accepted without negotiating the terms, that wanting more than what was explicitly given was a kind of presumption that led to embarrassment. She was trying very hard not to believe those things. She was not always succeeding. The night Vivian, leaving after her third Thursday visit, said her cruelest words, said them on the porch, where she thought Mabel couldn't hear, said them to Silas in the particular tone of a woman, reminding a man of something she expected him to already know. Mabel was standing at the kitchen window with a dish towel in her hands. Silas. Vivian's voice carried clean through the evening air. She works very hard, I'll grant you that. But you understand what this looks like. To people who matter, you married a woman because you needed a cook. That's fine, that's a practical arrangement. But don't let the practicality become a confusion. You know what you need, and you know what I can offer. Silas's response was too low to hear. Vivian's was not Silas, darling. I'm not criticizing. I'm simply saying a man in your position. Think about what the county sees when they look at your wife. Think about what she is. Mabel set the dish towel down on the table. She walked to the back of the kitchen, to the small room that was hers, and she sat on the edge of the cot in the dark. She was not going to cry. She had decided some time ago that she was finished crying over things that people said about her body, about her worth, about the space she did or didn't deserve to occupy. She sat in the dark and breathed, and she thought, I have rebuilt this kitchen with my own hands. I have fed 20 men every day. I have fixed what was broken, and made sound what was rotting, and brought life back into a room that had given up. And I am still to Vivian Harcourt just the thing in the kitchen. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went back to the kitchen, built the fire up in the stove for the morning, and began planning breakfast. Because the only answer she had ever known how to give was the one she gave in the work. She was not. She had decided this, firmly in the dark. She was not going to let Vivian Harcourt's voice be the loudest one in the room. Not yet, not while there was still something left to prove. The morning after Vivian Harcourt's voice had carried through the evening air and settled into Mabel's chest like a splinter she couldn't reach, Mabel made sourdough. Not because anyone had asked for it, not because the menu required it. She made it because sourdough was the most demanding bread. She knew the kind that punished inattention, that required you to be present in your hands and not in your head, and she needed something that would pull her out of the place she'd been sitting since the night before. She fed the starter at 4 in the morning. She turned the dough at 6. She shaped the loaves at 8, covered them, and left them to proof in the warmth beside the stove while she made the regular breakfast. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge and the ranch hands were coming back from the first morning shift, the sourdough was in the oven, and the kitchen smelled like something that had taken actual effort to produce. Silas came in at 9:30. He poured coffee as he'd started doing and stood at the work table with his cup. Mabel was scoring the second loaf with a knife, drawing the pattern across the surface that would let it open properly in the heat. She didn't look up. Vivian left early, he said. I know. I heard the wagon a pause. She said some things last evening. Expect she did. He was quiet. She could feel him choosing words, not a man who said things carelessly, which she'd learned, but also not a man who found it easy to say the things that needed saying. He lived in the gap between those two qualities more often than was comfortable for either of them. Mabel, the bread needs to go in, she said. Give me a minute. She slid the loaf onto the baking stone and closed the oven door. She washed her hands at the basin. She turned around. Silas was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that was uncomfortable and deliberate at once. The face of a man who has decided to push through his own reluctance. Started. About what the county sees. About what she thinks you. He stopped. Tried again. I want you to know that's not how Silas, she said it quietly, not sharply. You don't have to, I think I do. You don't. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to explain her to me. I've met women like Vivian Harcourt my entire life. I know what she thinks. I know what most of the county thinks. She paused. What I care about is what you think, and you've never made me feel like what she said. So you don't owe me a speech about it. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. All right, she turned back to the oven and checked the temperature without needing to. Bread'll be ready in 40 minutes if you want some. He stayed for the bread. He ate it standing at the work table, which had become his habit, and she thought, not for the first time, and not without some aggravation at herself, that she would be sorry when he stopped. What Mabel had not told Silas, and would not have known how to, was that Vivian's words had done something more than hurt. They had clarified something she'd been trying not to look at directly for weeks. She had feelings for her husband. This was inconvenient, and impractical, and possibly unwise, and she understood all three of those things clearly. An arranged marriage was a transaction, and transactions ran better when emotions were kept on the practical side of the ledger. She had known this going in. She had planned for it. She had arrived in Coldwater with the specific intention of being useful, of being competent, of keeping her expectations rational, and her heart her own business. Problem was that Silas Boone had turned out to be the kind of man who handed you a tool before you asked for it, and listened when you talked, and fixed broken things without needing credit for it, and she had not adequately prepared for that. She had also not prepared for the way he sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway in the early morning before anyone else was. Not to talk, not for any particular reason, just present, and how the kitchen felt different when he was in it. Fuller, less like a place she was managing, and more like a place she was part of. She was not going to tell him any of this. She was going to make preserves. The cherry trees on the eastern edge of the ranch property, she'd found them during her second week, walking the fence line on a Sunday afternoon when she needed air and space and something to look at besides the inside of a kitchen, had been badly pruned and were carrying more fruit than they could support, which meant the early cherries were dropping before they were fully ripe. She'd picked up everything she could reach and brought it back in her apron and stood in the kitchen, looking at perhaps 4 pounds of sour cherries in various stages of ripeness, and decided that losing them was not something she was prepared to do. She made her first batch of sour cherry preserves on a Thursday afternoon, between the noon meal and supper. She wasn't satisfied with it. The set was slightly loose, which meant her pectin timing was off, and the balance between sweet and sour was too far toward sweet for her taste. She made a second batch on Saturday, adjusting the ratio. Better, not right yet. The preserving became a project, which was how Mabel addressed most things that interested her, systematically, with notes written on the back of whatever paper was available, adjusting variables one at a time until she found the version that was exactly what she'd intended. Harlan Pike walked into the kitchen on the afternoon of her third batch, which he almost never did. The kitchen was Mabel's territory, and the foreman respected territories, and stopped when he smelled the cherries. "What is that?" he said. "Preserves." He looked at the jars cooling on the shelf. "Those for the ranch?" "Some of them." She was skimming foam from the top of the batch, focused. "The rest I'm putting up for the fair." A pause. "County fairs in September." "I know." Another pause. "Vivian Harcourt enters the preserves competition every year." Mabel looked at him then. Harlan's face was its usual arrangement of not quite fitting together, and his expression was the carefully neutral one he used when he had an opinion he hadn't decided to share yet. "Does she win?" Mabel asked. "Usually good for her." She went back to the foam. "There's room on a prize table for more than one jar." Harlan was quiet for a moment, longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "She's got a lot of friends on the judging committee." "Harlan." She didn't look up. "I'm not worried about Vivian Harcourt." She was a little. She would not have admitted it under any circumstances. He left. She ladled the preserve into a clean jar and held it up to the light coming through the kitchen window. The color was better this time, deeper, a real dark red rather than the pinkish tint of the first batch. Tipped the jar slightly and watched the way the preserve moved against the glass. The set was right. The color was right. She tasted it on the back of a spoon. Sweet first, then the sour opening behind it, then a long finish that was neither one thing nor the other, but something in between that was exactly what a well-made sour cherry preserve was supposed to be. She put the jar on the shelf and allowed herself 30 seconds of private satisfaction. Then she started supper. The trouble with Vivian Harcourt was that she didn't go away. Mabel had understood, from the first Thursday visit and the ones that followed, that Vivian was not the kind of woman who abandoned a project. She had decided that Silas Boone was her project, or rather that reclaiming what she felt she'd been denied was her project. And Silas was the mechanism, and she pursued it with the particular persistence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. The visits continued through May and into June. Vivian always brought something, a cake from the bakery in town, or a book she thought Silas might enjoy, or information about some county matter she felt he should be aware of. She always stayed longer than necessary. She always spoke to Mabel in the tone of a woman addressing staff. Mabel served her coffee. Mabel was polite. Mabel gave nothing back that could be used against her. But there were days when the effort of that cost her more than she showed. One afternoon in late May, when Vivian had stayed for 3 hours, and left with the particular satisfied look of a woman who felt she'd made progress, Mabel was in the kitchen working dough with more force than the dough required. And Denny Alcott came in to fill his water bottle and stood watching her for a moment before he said, in the careful way of a young man who had learned to read rooms, "You okay, Mrs. Boone?" She was not okay precisely, but she was not the kind of woman who said that. "Fine," she said. "Right." He filled his bottle, started to leave. Stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, to the doorframe rather than to her. "The men, most of us, we don't think what she thinks." He paused. "About you, I mean. We think you're, Good. He seemed to realize he was not expressing himself with great elegance and added, real good, at everything. Then he left quickly. Mabel stood with the dough in her hands. She thought, that was the kindest thing anyone has said to me in months, and it came from a 20-year-old ranch hand who almost certainly talked to the doorframe because he couldn't look at her when he said it. And that was fine. That was exactly fine. She was not going to make more of it than it was. She was also, she realized, going to remember it for a long time. It was Burl who noticed first that Silas was changing. Burl was not an observant man in the conventional sense. He didn't traffic in gossip, didn't pay attention to the subtle social architecture of the ranch the way Harlan did, but he was the kind of man who noticed the physical world with great accuracy because his work required it. He knew when a horse was moving differently before the horse knew it. He knew when a fence post had shifted 2 inches overnight. And he noticed, sometime in early June, that the boss was in a better mood than he'd been in 3 years, and that this corresponded with a pattern. He mentioned it to Denny because Denny was the only person on the ranch young enough to think observation and conversation were compatible activities. He's always in a better mood after he's been in the kitchen, Burl said. Denny thought about this. You think he's sweet on her? I think he doesn't know what he is, Burl said, which is different. What do we do about it? Nothing. Burl went back to the harness he was mending. Not our business. Denny accepted this with the confidence of someone who intended to find the business very interesting anyway. June night it rained for 17 hours straight and took part of the barn roof. It was the night Mabel understood something had shifted between her and Silas, though she couldn't have said precisely when the shift had happened. The storm came in from the northwest without much warning. The sky had been wrong all afternoon. A particular yellow-gray that she'd seen before and distrusted, and by 9 in the evening the rain was coming down with the kind of commitment that suggested it had made a decision about this and wasn't revisiting it. She heard the barn roof go sometime around midnight, a crack, then a sustained tearing sound, then the crash of timber. By the time she'd pulled on her coat and boots and gotten to the kitchen door, Silas was already crossing the yard at a run, lantern in hand, and most of the hands were spilling out of the bunkhouse. The barn's east section had lost its peak. A full 8 feet of roofline had collapsed inward, taking 2 of the supporting rafters with it. No horses injured, which was the first thing anyone checked, but the damage to the structure was significant, and the rain was pouring through the gap without any interest in stopping. The next 4 hours were what frontier life actually looked like, stripped of the version that made it into stories. 17 people working in the dark and the cold and the wet to contain something that couldn't be fully contained, covering the gap with tarps weighted with anything heavy they could find, getting the horses to the safe end of the barn, shoring up the rafters that were still standing with whatever lumber was close to hand. Mabel was in it with them. She couldn't do the heavy timber work. Nobody assigned her that, and she didn't argue the point, but she could carry and fetch and hold a lantern steady while Silas and Harlan worked on a joint that needed 2 people and a third set of eyes to get right. She was soaked through to the skin within the first 20 minutes, and past caring about it by the 30-minute mark. At some point around 2 in the morning, when the immediate crisis had been contained and the tarp situation was as good as it was going to get in the dark, Silas turned from the rafter he'd just secured and found her standing beside him, holding a lamp, and the look on his face, when he saw her there wet, muddy, still holding the lamp steady after hours of it, was not something she could decode in the moment. You should be inside, he said. So should you. His mouth did the thing it did when he was trying not to something and failing to prevent himself from almost saying it. Then he just nodded once and turned back to the barn. She stayed until there was nothing left to do. Then she went back to the kitchen and rebuilt the fire and made coffee and biscuits because 20 exhausted wet men were going to need something at 3 in the morning, whether they knew it yet or not. When the hands came in from the barn, they found coffee on the table and a basket of biscuits that were, by any reasonable measure, not a thing that should have existed at that hour. Nobody said anything about it. They drank the coffee and ate the biscuits in a silence that was thick with something that wasn't quite tiredness. Silas came in last. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the room, the fire, the coffee, the men at the table, her at the stove still working, and she had the clear sensation of being seen, not examined but actually seen, in the way that she rarely allowed herself to want. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know. He came to the stove and poured coffee and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the damp of his coat, and they stood there watching the fire for a while without speaking. The roof can be fixed, he said eventually. I know that too. Take about a week, probably. Maybe less, if the weather holds. I'll help where I can. He looked at her sideways. You did help out there. Held a lamp. You held it steady for 2 hours in the rain. Harlan couldn't have gotten that joint right without the light. He paused. Couldn't have. She didn't answer. The fire snapped. One of the ranch hands at the table made a comment to Denny about the biscuits, and Denny agreed emphatically, and the quiet conversation of exhausted men filled the room around them. Mabel, Silas said, low enough that it was only for her. She looked at him. He seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. He looked back at the fire. Thank you, he said, for this. For all of it. It was such a small sentence. It covered too much ground to be small. She felt it settle somewhere in her chest, in a place she'd been trying to keep vacant. You're welcome, she said, and went back to the biscuits. The barn roof took 9 days. Mabel helped where she could and where she was useful, and didn't push into spaces that weren't hers, and somewhere in the middle of those 9 days, the dynamic between her and Silas crossed a line that neither of them named, but both of them felt. It happened in small moments. He started asking her opinion on things that weren't kitchen business, whether the east fence should be moved back to its original line, or whether the new placement made better sense, whether the storage arrangement in the smaller outbuilding was practical or just habitual. She gave her opinions directly, and he listened to them and sometimes disagreed, and they argued the point, and she won sometimes and he won sometimes, and neither of them made anything of it. He stopped treating the kitchen as a place he was permitted to visit and started treating it as a room in his own house, which she supposed it was, which she supposed she was glad of. She supposed she was going to have to think about eventually. Vivian came on a Thursday in the middle of the barn repair and found Mabel at the work table making a list of lumber dimensions that still needed to be sourced. She looked at the list. She looked at Mabel. Working on the barn, she said, keeping track of what's needed. Silas has a foreman for that. Harlan has enough to manage. Mabel did not look up from the list. This takes 20 minutes. The silence stretched. Then Vivian sat down at the kitchen table, not a thing she had done before, and folded her hands and looked at Mabel with an expression that was performing civility in the way that well-dressed women sometimes performed it, carefully, the effort showing just enough to be uncomfortable. Mabel, she said, may I speak plainly? Mabel set her pencil down and looked at her. Silas and I have known each other for 15 years, Vivian said. Our families are connected. We have history and standing, and he needs more than what this arrangement provides. You understand that, don't you? What you have with him is practical. It functions. But there are things he needs from a wife that can't be satisfied by a woman who she paused selecting, who fills a very useful domestic role. Kitchen was very quiet. Outside, someone was hammering on the barn. Mabel sat down across from her, folded her own hands on the table, looked at Vivian Harcourt steadily, the way she looked at everything she'd decided to face without flinching. Vivian, she said, I want to be honest with you, because I think you're smart enough to handle honesty better than you think you are. She paused. I know what you're trying to do. I know why you come on Thursdays and what you're saying when you talk around what you mean. And I'm not going to fight you about Silas, because Silas isn't a thing to be fought over. He's a person, and what he decides about his life is his business, not ours. Vivian's expression had shifted into something more careful. What I will tell you, Mabel continued, is that I am not leaving. I am not making myself smaller so that you're more comfortable. I am not going to apologize for being here, or for the work I do, or for anything about myself that doesn't match what you think a woman in my position ought to look like. She picked up her pencil, and if Silas decides, after all of that what you're offering is what he wants, that's between him and me. Not you and me, she went back to the list. Vivian sat very still. Then, without another word, she stood and left the kitchen and left the ranch. And Mabel heard the oiled wheels of her carriage on the road for longer than usual, which was fine, because it gave her time to stop her hands from shaking before anyone saw. She did not tell Silas about the conversation. This was a decision she reached deliberately and stood by without second-guessing. She had not come to this marriage to cause him problems or to make him the arbiter of conflicts. She could handle herself, and she had no interest in the particular position it would put him in having to choose sides before he'd chosen anything. What she noticed in the weeks that followed was that Vivian's Thursday visits became less frequent. Then they stopped entirely. She didn't know what to make of that and decided not to make anything of it. What she made instead was more preserves. By mid-July, she had 14 jars on the shelf, sour cherry in 3 different iterations, a plum preserve she'd made from trees she found along the creek, an apple butter that she'd tested twice, and was happy with the second time, kitchen shelf that she'd rebuilt from scratch on her first week, carried them in a row that was, he thought, probably the most satisfying thing she'd produced since arriving. Silas noticed them during his mid-morning coffee one day in late July and stood looking at the row without saying anything for a moment. These for the fair? Some of them. The sour cherry. Which one's the best? Third from the left. Second batch with the adjusted ratio. He picked it up and looked at it. The color in the jar was the deep red she'd been working toward, not pink, not brown. A real cherry red that stayed clear all the way through. Can I taste it? She handed him a spoon. He opened the jar and dipped the spoon and tasted it. And his expression did a thing she'd learned to watch for, a slight change in his eyes when something surprised him, in a way he hadn't expected to be surprised. That's Mabel, that's exceptional. She took the jar back and sealed it. I know. He laughed. She hadn't heard him laugh before, not really laugh, not the unprepared kind that happens before a person decides whether to let it out. It was short, and it surprised him as much as it surprised her, and after it happened he looked slightly thrown by it, which she found she appreciated because it meant it was real. You're not modest, he said. I know what's good. That's not a modesty, it's just paying attention. She put the jar back in its place. I've been working on it since May. I'm allowed to know when I got it right. You're right, he said. You are allowed. He said it simply, without flourish, and she believed him, and that the specific quality of being believed by this particular person was something she carried with her for the rest of the day. July became August, with the particular relentlessness of summer on the frontier, where the heat built with sympathy and the work did not slow to accommodate it. The ranch hands were harder to keep fed at the right times because the hours shifted with the light, and the cattle work didn't care about meal schedules. Mabel adjusted. She started putting food out at 2 intervals instead of 1 in the mid-afternoon, which meant more work but fewer men going too long without eating, which meant better tempers and fewer small accidents. Harlan Pike noticed the change without comment and then mentioned it to Silas, who mentioned it to Mabel, who said she had figured it was the sensible adjustment. Harlan said it's the best-run kitchen the ranch has had, Silas said. Did he say it like that? Or did he say something that meant that? Silas paused. Adjustments are working. That's Harlan for excellent, Mabel said. I'll take it. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which had also become a thing that had crept up on her without intention. The habit of the two of them sitting in the evening air while the light changed, not talking particularly, just present in the same space. It had started one evening when the kitchen was too warm to stay in after cooking, and she'd come out for air and found him already there, and neither of them had suggested the other leave, and so they'd stayed. It was the kind of thing that happened between people who were becoming something to each other before either of them had named it. He said, looking out at the yard, "What made you enter the fair?" It wasn't quite a question. Because I make a good preserve and I want people to taste it, she said. Because I worked hard on it, and hard work deserves its chance. She paused. Because there's a woman in this county who thinks certain things belong to her by right, and I don't believe that. And I think showing up is the way to say so without making a speech about it. Quiet for a moment, Vivian. I didn't say her name. You didn't have to. He was quiet. She hasn't come by in a while. I noticed. Another quiet. Then what did you say to her? She looked at him. How do you know I said anything? Because you say things, clearly and directly and without wasting words. He looked back at her. And because she left in a hurry and hasn't come back. Mabel considered her answer. I told her that what you decide about your life is your business, not hers. And I told her I wasn't going anywhere. Silas held her gaze for a moment, longer than was comfortable, or rather longer than was comfortable in the way that some discomforts are worth sitting in. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They watched the sky change color above the western ridge, and the first of the evening's cooling air came down from the north, and the kitchen behind them was dark and clean, and finished for the day. And Mabel did not examine what she was feeling with any precision, because some things were better left to develop in their own time. What she knew was this. She had come to a broken ranch as a woman nobody expected much from. She had made the kitchen the best room on the property. She had fed 20 men without missing a day. She had stood in a rainstorm holding a lamp steady for 2 hours. She had said what she meant to a woman twice as socially powerful as she would ever be. And she had a row of 14 jars on the shelf, the best of which was a sour cherry preserve. She had perfected through months of careful work, and in September she was going to take it to the Coldwater County Fair, and the judges were going to taste it. And whatever happened after that was going to happen on the basis of the work itself. She was not afraid of that. She thought sitting in the evening air beside a man she had not expected to feel anything for, and absolutely did cautiously, privately, in the way that was the only way she knew how to be anything. Hopeful, not for a rescue, not for permission, not for someone to tell her she'd earned her place. Just hopeful that what she'd built here, in this kitchen and on this ranch, and maybe in the particular quality of the evenings on this porch, might turn out to be something that lasted. Stars came out one at a time, the way things worth keeping always come. The hopeful feeling lasted about 3 weeks before the county got involved. It started with small things, the kind of small things that are easy to dismiss individually and impossible to ignore in aggregate. A woman at the dry goods store who had been perfectly pleasant to Mabel on her first 2 visits suddenly found reasons to be busy when Mabel came in. The wife of one of the neighboring ranchers, a woman named Clara Sturch, who had nodded at Mabel at the post office in a way that suggested future friendliness, crossed to the other side of the street in August without acknowledgement. The boy who delivered supplies to the ranch 13, gap-toothed, generally cheerful, arrived one Thursday with a box of flour and a look of studied neutrality that sat wrong on his young face, like a coat borrowed from someone twice his size. Mabel noticed all of it. She said nothing. What she understood, without needing it explained, was that Vivian Harcourt had not retreated. She had simply changed tactics. The Thursday visits had stopped because Vivian had found something more efficient than showing up in person. She had started talking. And in a county where everyone knew everyone, and social standing was currency as real as silver, talking was the most powerful thing a woman like Vivian could do. Mabel learned the specifics from an unlikely source. It was Harlan Pike who told her. Not because he was the type to traffic in gossip, he wasn't, and he would have been offended by the characterization, but because Harlan considered information about threats to the ranch's functioning to be operational data, and Vivian Harcourt poisoning the county against the boss's wife qualified. He came to the kitchen on a Wednesday morning in mid-August, when the hands were out and Silas was in town, and stood in the doorway, in the way he always stood in doorways, like a man who hadn't decided yet whether he was coming in. "You should know what's being said," he told her. She kept stirring the pot she was working on. "Then tell me," he told her. He was brief about it and did not embellish, which she appreciated. The version circulating in Coldwater was that Silas Boone had been taken advantage of by a desperate woman from Missouri who had misrepresented herself to secure a comfortable situation, that the marriage was an embarrassment to the Boone name, that Silas was too proud to admit his mistake, but that anyone with eyes could see he'd gotten far less than he deserved, and that a man of his standing, wealthy, respected, with a ranch that ran some of the finest cattle in the territory, deserved a wife who could stand beside him in society. Not one who belonged in the kitchen she'd apparently decided to make her permanent residence. Mabel listened to all of it without stopping what she was doing. When Harlan finished, she said, "Who's saying it?" "Vivian's the source. After that, it spreads the way things spread." Silas hearing it, some of it. Men don't tell him directly, but it gets back. She set the spoon down on the rest beside the stove. She looked at the pot. She picked the spoon back up. "All right," she said. "That's all?" Harlan said. "What else should there be?" He was quiet for a moment. Some women would want their husband to do something about it. Silas isn't responsible for what Vivian Harcourt says. He didn't hire her to talk. She tasted the pot and adjusted the salt. And I don't need him to defend me from gossip. I need to do that myself. Harlan looked at her for a moment with the expression he wore when he was recalibrating something. "How?" "By being exactly what I am," she said, loud enough that the gossip runs out of room. He considered this, nodded once, the short, decisive nod that was his version of approval, and left. Mabel stood alone in the kitchen and allowed herself 2 minutes of feeling every sharp edge of what Harlan had told her, the ugliness of it, the particular cruelty of being talked about in terms that reduced her to a collection of deficits, the injustice of having built something real, and watching someone try to dismantle the reputation of it with nothing but words over tea. 2 minutes, then she went back to work. Silas brought it up himself that evening on the porch. He didn't come at it directly. He wasn't a man who came at things directly when they cost him something, but he'd been carrying it since he got back from town. She could see that particular stillness of a man, holding something he wasn't sure what to do with. "I heard something in town today," he said. "I expect you did." He looked at her. "You already know. Harlan told me this morning." Pause. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she'd noticed, something he did when he was thinking through what he actually believed, rather than what he was supposed to believe. "I want to say something about it." "All right. What's being said isn't true." "None of it." His voice was even and deliberate. "You didn't misrepresent anything. You answered an advertisement honestly, and you've done everything you said you'd do, and a good deal more." Anyone saying otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about, or is choosing not to. She looked at him. I know that. I know you know it. I'm saying it anyway. He set the coffee cup down. Because I should have said something in town today, when I heard it and I didn't. And I've been sitting with that since. This surprised her more than the gossip had. What stopped you? He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure what I had the right to say. Whether he stopped, tried again. Whether speaking up looked like I was defending a business arrangement or defending my wife. And I wasn't sure which you'd want. The porch was quiet. Down in the barn, one of the horses moved, and the sound of it came clearly through the still evening air. Those aren't different things, Mabel said carefully. I think they might be. She looked at him for a long moment. Silas, what is it you're trying to say? He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had come to the edge of something and was deciding whether the ground on the other side would hold him. I'm not sure yet, he said, but I wanted you to know that I'm saying something. Next time. It wasn't much. It was also, she recognized, more than he'd offered easily, and she understood that it had cost him something to offer it, not money, not effort, but the particular currency of a private man saying something vulnerable in plain air. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. They sat until the dark came in and the stars settled, and neither of them said anything else about it. And the silence was the kind that felt like a step forward rather than an absence. Next time came sooner than either of them had planned. Coldwater Ladies Charitable Society held its late summer supper in the third week of August in the large hall behind the general store, and attendance was one of those social obligations that the county's residents understood to be technically optional and practically required. Silas had gone every year. He went this year, and Mabel went with him, because she was his wife and because she was not going to hide in the kitchen and confirm everything Vivian Harcourt had been saying about her. She wore the best dress she owned. It was dark blue wool, well made but not new, and it fit her the way clothes often didn't. She'd taken it in herself at the shoulders and let it out at the sides, doing it properly, with even stitches and matching thread, so the alterations didn't show. She had no jewelry worth mentioning, except a small cameo brooch that had been her mother's, which she pinned at the collar. She put her hair up without fuss. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room and thought, this is what I look like, and that's what there is, and I'm going in. The hall was full when they arrived. Lanterns along the walls, long tables with white cloths, perhaps 80 people in various configurations of greeting, and avoiding and performing the particular social theater of a small community where everyone's history with everyone else was complicated by proximity and time. Mabel walked in beside Silas and felt the room adjust. Not dramatically, not all at once. But she had enough experience of rooms adjusting around her to know when it was happening, the conversations that paused a beat too long, the eyes that moved and then deliberately moved away, quality of the smiling that was one layer too careful. She smiled back at everyone with exactly the same expression. Warm, direct, unhurried. The expression of a woman who had nothing to perform. They sat at a table with two neighboring ranch families, the Aldermans and the Keatings, and the conversation was careful and not unpleasant, the way conversations are when everyone is working hard not to say the thing they're all aware of. Mabel answered questions about the ranch honestly and without self-consciousness, which seemed to confuse people who had been expecting her to be either defensive or obsequious. Margaret Keating, who was somewhere in her 60s and had the look of a woman who had outlasted several versions of county society and found them all more or less the same, asked Mabel directly how she was finding Sphere after Missouri. Harder, Mabel said. Better. Margaret Keating laughed a real laugh, not a social one, and said she'd felt exactly the same about it 40 years ago. It was for a while, all right. Then Vivian Harcourt arrived. Came in late, which was a choice, late enough to be noticed, early enough not to be rude, with two women Mabel recognized as her closest allies in the county's social architecture. She wore green silk that was entirely impractical for a charitable supper in a ranch town hall, and absolutely for its intended purpose of being the most visually arresting thing in the room. She found Silas across the crowd and acknowledged him with the specific smile of a woman who considers a man an investment that hasn't paid out yet but intends to. She acknowledged Mabel with a smile of a different kind entirely. The supper proceeded. Courses came and went. The conversation moved around the table and across the room in the way of these events. People migrating between groups, the night loosening slightly as the food arrived and the social pressure eased. Then Vivian spoke. She did it from across the room, loudly enough to carry, in the gap between one conversation ending and another, beginning the way these things are always done, in the space where the words have nowhere to go except everyone's ears. She was speaking to the woman beside her, but she was pitching her voice at the room. Of course, the Fair Preserves Committee is particularly selective this year. Eleanor Marsh has been on the judging panel for 15 years, and she said quite clearly that the competition is about more than just the product itself. It reflects on the woman who made it, the refinement, the background. A pause perfectly timed. One does feel that certain entries might be better suited to the farmhand's table than to a proper competition. The room went quiet. Not all of it, not immediately, but the quiet spread from the point of impact outward, the way a stone in still water moves, until enough people had heard and registered what had been said that the silence became collective. Everyone understood, nobody pretended not to. Mabel set her fork down. She looked at her plate for a moment. She thought about her mother's kitchen, and the cameo at her collar, and the sour cherry preserve sitting on the shelf in its jar, with its clear dark red color and its balance of sweet and sharp. She thought about 14 jars, and a rebuilt shelf, and a stove she'd cleaned back to the iron. She thought about Vivian Harcourt's voice the night she'd stood at the kitchen window with a dish towel in her hands. She looked up. She had been prepared to answer. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this moment was coming in some form, and she had decided what she would do with it. She would answer quietly and directly, and without making a scene, because making a scene was not her way, and she was not going to let Vivian goad her into something she'd regret. She did not get the chance. Silas stood up. It was not a dramatic gesture. He didn't knock anything over or raise his voice. He simply stood, pushed back from the table, rose to his full height, and turned to face the room with the particular stillness of a man who has made a decision and is finished deliberating about it. The hall was very quiet. Silas was not a man who made speeches. In 3 years of running the Boone Ranch, of attending county events and sitting on range association committees and negotiating cattle prices at the auction, nobody in Coldwater had ever heard him hold the room's attention for more than a sentence or two at a time. He said what needed saying and sat down. He looked at Vivian first. Then he looked at the room. My wife, he said, took a kitchen that was half rotted and falling apart and rebuilt it with her own hands in 6 days. She's fed 20 men every morning and evening without missing a day since she arrived. She repairs what's broken before it's asked of her. She held a lamp in a rainstorm for 2 hours while we saved the barn roof. The room held still. She entered a preserve in the county fair because she made something worth entering. Quality of her work speaks for itself, and the quality of her work is better than anything I've seen in this county in a long time. He paused. I've eaten at a lot of tables in Coldwater. I know which food comes from effort and skill and which comes from money and a hired cook. He looked at Vivian. My wife does her own work. I'd take that over refinement any day of the week. He sat down. The silence lasted another 3 seconds. Then Margaret Keating started clapping, not tentatively, not performing, but with the full-armed conviction of a woman who had been waiting for someone to say something true for the entire evening. The alderman couple joined in. Then others, gradually, unevenly, the applause spreading across the room in patches. It was not a standing ovation. It was not unanimous. Vivian's table was conspicuously still, but it was real and it was enough. Mabel looked at Silas. He was looking at his plate in the manner of a man who had said what he meant and was now done with the situation, and would prefer not to make more of it than it was. She reached under the table and found his hand. He went very still for a moment. Then his hand closed around hers and stayed. They didn't talk about it on the drive home. The night was clear and the road was familiar, and the horse knew the way. And sometimes things that have just happened need a little space before they become conversation. It was late when they got back to the ranch. The bunkhouse was dark. The kitchen was cold, the fire banked low, and Mabel built it up automatically while Silas put the horse away, the way things got done when a household had found its rhythm. She put water on for tea because her chest felt strange, and she needed something to do with her hands. He came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway. You didn't need me to do that, she said. No, I was going to answer her myself. I know, he came in and sat at the work table. I know you were. You always answer things yourself. He was quiet for a moment. But I told you I'd say something next time. That was next time. She poured the tea, set a cup in front of him, sat down across the table. What you said, she started. About the kitchen, the barn. True. I know it's true. That's not, she stopped. You said it in front of the whole county. I did. You didn't have to do it that loudly. He picked up his cup, looked at her over the rim. Maybe not, but I wanted to. The kitchen was warm now, the fire talking quietly in the stove, the clean smell of it mixing with the tea. Mabel looked at the man across the table, this private, deliberate man who had chosen, in a full room, to stand up, and felt the things she'd been careful not to feel directly push up against the careful distance she'd been keeping. Silas. She said his name the way she said things when she was deciding how honest to be. I have to ask you something. Ask. What do you want this to be? She kept her eyes level. This us, what we are. She paused. Because I came here for an arrangement, and that's what we have. And that's a fine thing. But what you did tonight, that wasn't an arrangement. That was something else. And I need to know what you think it is, because She paused, steadied herself. I'm not willing to guess anymore. He set the cup down. He looked at his hands on the table, the rancher's hands, scarred and strong and doing nothing right now except being still. When Eleanor left, he said, when my first wife died, I decided something. I decided that the ranch would run, and I would run the ranch, and that was the shape of things. Because everything else had a way of, he stopped, getting complicated, hurting. I understand that. I don't think you're a complication, he said. I thought you would be. When I put that advertisement in the paper, I thought I was solving a practical problem. He looked up at her. You are not a practical problem. Mabel waited. I don't know how to do this well, he said. Being whatever this is. I've been closed up for 3 years, and I'm not sure I remember how to be open, and I'll probably handle it wrong sometimes. He paused. But I don't want to keep sitting on that porch with you, and pretending I'm just being polite. The fire in the stove made a small sound. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You don't handle things as badly as you think you do. It's a low standard. It's accurate. She picked up her cup. I'm not looking for perfect, Silas. I've never been offered perfect, and I wouldn't trust it if it showed up. She paused. I'm looking for honest, and you are that. He was quiet. Then, carefully, in the way of a man stepping onto ice he wasn't certain of, and, You? What do you want? To be seen, she said, simply, without apology, not managed. Not accommodated. Seen, she set the cup down. And I think you do that. I think you've been doing it for a while, and neither of us said so. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have said the true thing, and are letting it settle in the room. All right, Silas said. All right, she said back. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution. It was two people deciding, without ceremony, to stop pretending. They weren't in the middle of something. County did not leave them alone. The morning after the charitable supper, the gossip engine that Vivian had built and maintained shifted into a different gear, no longer dismissive, but meaner, the way things get meaner when they feel threatened. Comments reached the ranch through Denny, who had not intended to carry them but was too young to know how to filter what he brought back from town, and through the supply deliveries, and once through a letter left at the post office addressed to Silas that was not signed and not worth responding to. The letters said that Silas had embarrassed himself, that he'd taken a stand for a woman who wasn't worth the standing, that Coldwater knew its own, and the woman he'd married wasn't one of them, and a man of his position should consider carefully what he was aligning himself with. Silas threw the letter in the stove. But Mabel saw his face before he did it, and she understood that the gossip was not sliding off him the way he was trying to let it appear. He was a proud man, not the showy kind of pride that wanted acknowledgement, but the quiet internal kind that felt the damage of public mockery more deeply for never mentioning it. She didn't bring it up directly. She brought him food instead. Not as a compensation, not as a strategy, she just made sure that the things she knew he liked best showed up on the table without announcement. The particular way she made the roast. Low and slow with the rosemary she'd been growing in a pot on the kitchen sill. The biscuits with the butter worked in rather than added after. The small evidence of attention that said, I see what you're carrying. You don't have to carry it alone. He noticed. She knew he noticed because he started sitting in the kitchen more, not in the mid-morning, but in the early evening before supper, just present while she worked, sometimes reading, sometimes just sitting, and once falling asleep in the chair by the stove, with his book on his knee, which she found and did not wake him from, and which she also did not mention the next morning. He mentioned it himself, gruffly, over breakfast. I fell asleep in your kitchen. You were tired still. Not proper, Silas. She looked at him. It's your kitchen, too. He didn't say anything, but he came back that evening. September arrived with a change in the air, not cold yet, but the first suggestion of it, the way the light went slightly golden in the afternoons, and the mornings had a clarity that summer's heat had suppressed. County Fair was 2 weeks out, and Mabel had her 3 jars of sour cherry preserve on the shelf, the second, the third, and a 4th batch she'd made in late August, that she believed was the best of all of them. the accumulated learning of 5 months distilled into a jar of dark red preserves that she'd sealed with more care than she'd applied to anything in recent memory. Vivian Harcourt entered the fair preparation with a public thoroughness that was itself a message. It became known, through the county's reliable information network, that she had engaged a specialist in St. Louis to source a particular variety of quince for her entry, that she had trialed 4 separate batches, that she had consulted with the county extension office about this year's judging criteria and had a personal relationship with 2 of the 3 judges. Mabel heard all of this and felt something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite contempt, but existed somewhere in the space between the specific feeling of someone who knows the game is rigged and intends to play it anyway. She told no one how nervous she was. She was not particularly prone to admitting nervousness, and besides, there was nothing to be done about it, except make sure the preserve was as good as she could make it. The Saturday before the fair, she took her 3 jars off the shelf and lined them up on the work table and looked at them. The 4th batch jar, the 3rd, the 2nd. She opened the 4th batch and tasted it with the small spoon she kept for exactly this purpose. Sweet leading, the sour opening behind it in a clean sweep, the long finish that settled into something that was neither one nor the other. The set was right, the color was right, she sealed it. Harlan came in and looked at the jars. He stood for a moment with his hands in his pockets. "Which one are you entering?" he said. "The 1st, the 3rd, and the 4th. He looked at the 4th. "That one's the best. You've tasted them all?" "I tasted the first one in July. The others I judged by eye and the look of you when you sealed them." Mabel looked at him. "By the look of me. You sealed the 4th one the way you fix a bracket." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She understood the care that shows when a person knows they've gotten something exactly right. "You think I can win," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I think your preserve is better than anything Vivian Harcourt has ever made. I also think Vivian Harcourt has friends on the judging committee." He paused. "Those 2 things are both true, and you should enter anyway." He looked at her directly with his mismatched face. "Because some things need to be put in front of people, whether they're ready to see them correctly or not. Because if the judging is honest, you'll win. And if it isn't, then you'll know that too, and you'll have shown the rest of the county what honest looks like." Mabel looked at the jars on the table. She thought about the county fair and the judging table and Vivian Harcourt's quince preserves and all the things that were stacked against her that were not about the quality of what was in those jars. She thought about a rebuilt kitchen shelf and a sealed window and a stove cleaned back to the iron. She thought about Silas standing up in a room full of people. "All right," Harlan said and left. Mabel put the jars carefully back on the shelf and turned back to the stove and started supper. And outside the kitchen window, the September light lay gold and long across the ranch yard, and the fair was 12 days away. She was not afraid. She was something harder and more useful than afraid. She was ready. The 12 days between Harlan's visit and the county fair were not 12 easy days. Mabel had expected the waiting to be straightforward. She had her jars. She had her decision. There was nothing left to do except let September move at its own pace and not think too hard about what was coming. She had underestimated the particular cruelty of anticipation, which is that it fills every quiet moment with the thing you're trying not to dwell on. She dwelled. Not openly, she was not a woman who wore her anxiety where other people could see it and comment on it, but in the small hours of the morning when the ranch was still and the fire had burned down to coals and there was nothing between her and her own thoughts, she lay on her cot and ran through every version of the fair she could imagine. The version where the judging was fair and the preserve won on its merits. The version where Vivian's connections outweighed everything. The version where she placed but didn't win and had to decide what that meant. The version where something went wrong with the jars in transit and the whole question became moot. She got up early on most of those mornings and went to the kitchen and made bread. Silas noticed. Because Silas noticed things about the kitchen, the way a rancher noticed things about his land, not by looking for them, but because they were part of the texture of his daily existence, and changes in texture registered automatically. He noticed that the bread production had increased, and that Mabel was moving through the kitchen with slightly more speed than usual, and that she was checking the preserved jars on the shelf with a frequency that had no practical purpose. He didn't say anything about any of it for the first week. On the 8th day before the fair, he came into the kitchen in the mid-morning with his coffee and stood at the work table and said, "You're worried." Mabel was rolling pastry. She did not stop. "I'm making a pie." "You're making a pie and you're worried." She pressed the rolling pin down the length of the dough. "What makes you say that? You've made 6 loaves of bread this week and it's only Thursday." She looked up at him. He was watching her, with the particular steadiness he brought to things he'd decided to address directly, and she recognized it and was briefly irritated by it because she'd been hoping to keep this contained. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you're fine. You're also worried." She set the rolling pin down, picked it up again, put it down. "The judging committee," she said finally. "Harlan told me Vivian has friends on it. I don't know how many, or how much that matters, or whether the judging actually follows the rules or follows the friendships." She looked at the dough. "I know what's in those jars. I know it's good. What I don't know is whether good is enough." Silas was quiet for a moment. "It's always enough," he said. "That's not true, and you know it." "No," he agreed. "It's not always true. But it's true more often than not when there are 3 judges and only one of them owes Vivian anything." He paused. "Eleanor Marsh is the head judge. She's been doing it for 15 years, and she has a reputation that means more to her than any social obligation. If your preserve is the best thing on that table, Eleanor Marsh will say so." Mabel looked at him. "You know Eleanor Marsh. We served on the Range Association Committee together for 4 years. He picked up his coffee. "She's not a woman who compromises her judgment for politeness." "How do you know?" "Because she told me my cattle management was inefficient in front of 12 other ranchers. And she was right, and she knew I knew she was right, and she said it anyway." He set the cup down. "She's that kind of person." Mabel absorbed this. "That's useful to know," she said. "I thought it might be." She went back to the pie, stayed at the work table and drank his coffee, and eventually started talking about the East Fence situation he was planning to address before winter. And the kitchen moved back into its ordinary rhythm, and the worry didn't disappear, but it settled into a more manageable shape. That was, she thought, the particular value of the kind of company he'd become. Not that it solved anything, but that it made the unsolvable things feel less like they were hers alone. Fair opened on a Friday morning with the particular organized chaos of an event that had been planned for months and was still slightly unprepared for its own arrival. The grounds outside Coldwater's Main Street had been set up over 2 days' exhibition tents, livestock pens, a long row of vendor tables, the preserved goods tent at the east end, where the competition entries had been accepted and logged the previous afternoon. Mabel had brought her 3 jars on Thursday as required. She had carried them herself, wrapped in cloth in a basket, and handed them to the registration table with her name and the category written on the forms in her careful handwriting. The woman at the table, young, efficient, slightly overwhelmed, had logged them, tagged them, and arranged them on the shelf behind her with about 30 other entries, without ceremony or comment. Mabel had looked at her jars on the shelf among all the others and thought, "All right, now it's out of my hands." It was the most uncomfortable kind of situation. She knew the kind where the work was finished and the outcome was pending, and there was nothing left to do except wait and not think about it. She was not good at that. She was good at the working. The waiting was a different skill, and she'd never quite acquired it. The fair morning was clear and cool, the September air having fully committed to the season now, and the county had shown up in the way small communities showed up for things that mattered, not just the families who entered competitions or bought from vendors, but everyone, because this was the occasion, and the occasion was the reason. Children ran between the livestock pens. Old men gathered near the equipment displays and argued about machinery. Women moved in clusters from tent to tent with the purposeful energy of people who had organized most of what was here and were now assessing whether it had come out correctly. Mabel came with Silas. She wore the blue wool dress again because it was the best she had, and she was not apologetic about that. She had the cameo at her collar. She walked beside her husband through the fairgrounds with the calm exterior of a woman who had decided not to let the morning be about anything except what it actually was, a day at the fair, the work already done, the outcome to be what it would be. She believed about 60% of that. The other 40% was in the preserved tent. Denny Alcott found them near the livestock pens. Where Silas was looking at a bull someone had brought from 3 counties over that was, objectively, a remarkable animal. Denny had come with 2 other hands, Burl, inevitably, moving through the fair crowd like a large, gentle obstacle that people walked around without registering, and they fell in with the group in the comfortable way of people who belonged to the same place. "I heard Vivian's quince entry has a hand-etched label," Denny said to no one in particular. "That's not what they're judging," Mabel said. "I know. I'm just saying." He paused. The jar looked fancy. "Denny." Burl said his name in the way he said most things, flatly, with the weight of a man who found most conversation unnecessary. "I'm just reporting what I saw. Reporting isn't helping. I'm allowed to report." Mabel watched this exchange with the specific affection she'd developed. For these 2 over 5 months, the young man who talked too much and meant well, and the large, quiet man who had decided she was worth carrying wood for, and had once made her feel as though that were an imposition. She had not expected, coming to this ranch, to end up with people she was actually fond of. She had expected to do her work and be respected for it, and that was to have been enough. Turned out enough had a higher ceiling than she'd planned for. The morning moved. They saw the livestock judging, where Silas's entry in the working cattle category placed second, and he received the news with the equanimity of a man who had expected it and wasn't bothered. They ate at the vendor table's meat pies that were decent, lemonade that was too sweet, a slice of corn cake from a woman 2 tables down who clearly knew what she was doing. Burl ate 3 slices of the corn cake, each time returning to the vendor with the wordless determination of a man acting on conviction. The preserved goods judging was scheduled for 2 o'clock. At 1:45, Mabel walked to the preserve tent alone. She had not asked anyone to come. Silas had looked at her when she said she was going, and had looked as though he was going to say something, and then recognized that she needed to do this part without an audience, and had simply nodded. The tent was already gathering a crowd. Preserved goods might have seemed like a minor category to people from outside Coldwater County, but it wasn't. It had a 15-year history of passionate competition and strong opinions, and one memorable year in the mid-1870s when the judging result had caused a feud between 2 families that lasted until the following spring. People in Coldwater took their preserves seriously. The judging table ran along the center of the tent, 40 feet of white cloth covered with entries, each one tagged and numbered, the entrant's name known only to the registration logs held by the committee secretary. The 3 judges moved along the table in a row, Eleanor Marsh in the center, a tall woman in her 60s with white hair and the erect posture of someone who had never once in her life made herself smaller for a room. Clifton Drake on her left, a retired grocer with a palate that was locally legendary, and Ada Spenner on her right, who was Vivian's friend, and who Mabel had clocked the moment she walked in. Mabel found a place to stand near the side of the tent where she could see the judging table, without being directly in anyone's line of sight. She watched. The process was methodical. Each judge tasted independently, made notes, consulted occasionally in low voices that didn't carry. Eleanor Marsh worked with the focused attention of someone who was entirely inside the task. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the crowd building at the tent's edges, didn't register anything except what was on her spoon. Vivian was on the other side of the tent with her 2 allies, dressed for the occasion in a deep burgundy that managed to be simultaneously appropriate for a fair and better than anything else in the tent. She was speaking quietly to the woman beside her and watching the judges with the expression of someone who had already decided the outcome and was waiting for reality to confirm it. The judges reached the middle section of the table. Mabel realized she was holding her breath and made herself stop. They moved through a row of apple butters, a section of berry jams, a cluster of what appeared to be specialty preserves in unusual varieties. Ada Spenner made a note on her clipboard after each one. Clifton Drake paused at a jar of something amber-colored and went back to taste it twice. Eleanor Marsh moved steadily, not hurrying, not dawdling. Then they reached the sour cherry section. There were 6 entries in the category. The judges moved through them, left to right. Mabel watched Eleanor Marsh's face for the tells she'd been watching, for the slight change of expression, the almost imperceptible pause, the instinct of a practiced taster registering something that exceeded expectation. She didn't see anything on the first 3 jars. The 4th jar, and Mabel knew by its placement it was hers. The 4th batch, the one Harlan had assessed correctly by the look on her face when she sealed it. Eleanor Marsh dipped her spoon, tasted, set the spoon down, picked it up again, and tasted a second time. She said something to Clifton Drake. He dipped his spoon. His eyebrows moved, slightly, not dramatically. The way a man who has eaten 10,000 things and reached judgments on all of them moves his eyebrows when something surprises him. Ada Spenner tasted last. Her expression was careful and uninformative, which told Mabel something. The judges moved to the remaining 2 jars, tasted them, made their notes. Then they huddled at the end of the table in the low-voiced conference of the final deliberation, clipboards in hand, and the tent went very quiet in the way of a crowd that has been building towards something and is now at the moment before it. Mabel felt her heart doing something irregular in her chest. She kept her face still. The deliberation lasted 4 minutes. Counted. Eleanor Marsh straightened. She took the small blue ribbon from the committee secretary, Cele Best in Show, the single top honor of the preserved goods competition, and she walked back along the table and stopped. She stopped in front of Mabel's jar. She set the ribbon down beside it. Then she looked up at the registration log the secretary brought over, found the name, and turned to the crowd. Best in show. Preserved goods, Eleanor Marsh said, in a voice that had no performance in it, just information being delivered accurately. Sour cherry preserve, Mabel Boone. The tent went very still for a full second. Then Denny Alcott, from somewhere near the back of the tent where he had apparently been standing the whole time, said yes, with a volume and conviction that broke the stillness entirely, and the applause started. It wasn't unanimous. Vivian's section of the tent was quiet in the concentrated way of people suppressing a reaction. But the rest, Margaret Keating was there, and the Aldermans, and a dozen other families Mabel had served at the charitable supper, or seen in town, or simply existed in the same county, with for 5 months the rest was real. Mabel walked to the table. Her legs were doing something slightly unreliable, which she did not show. Eleanor Marsh held out the ribbon. Exceptional balance, she said, with the directness of a woman who said what she meant, and nothing else. Sweetness and tartness in a ratio that's very difficult to achieve. The set is correct, and the color is remarkable. She paused. How many batches did it take? 4, Mabel said. Eleanor Marsh nodded, as though this confirmed something. The work shows, she said. That's what judging is for. She moved away. Mabel stood with the blue ribbon in her hand. She looked at it. The silk was cheap, the printing slightly off-center, the whole thing not worth more than 20 cents in materials. It was the best thing she had held in recent memory. Silas appeared beside her. She hadn't seen him come in, hadn't known he'd been there, but he was there, standing close enough that she could feel the solid presence of him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no word for except true, the expression of a person seeing something exactly as it is and finding it exactly right. Told you, he said. You told me Eleanor Marsh was honest, she said. You didn't tell me she'd say the work showed. I didn't know she'd say that. It was the right thing to say. It was accurate, he said. The work did show. The work always showed. Burl appeared on her other side, large and solid and saying nothing, which was his version of celebration, and then Denny was there being inarticulate with enthusiasm. And Harlan Pike came through the crowd with the careful movement of a man, navigating something he felt both meaningful, slightly uncomfortable. And he looked at the ribbon and then at her and said, better than anything Vivian Harcourt has ever made. You already said that. I'm saying it again. She looked around the tent. People were coming over, not all of them. Not the ones from Vivian's circle, but enough. Margaret Keating, the Aldermans, people she'd seen in town, people she'd fed at the supper, people she'd nodded at in the street, and who had nodded back and not gone further. They were coming over now, and the distance between her and the county felt different than it had an hour ago. Not gone, not erased, but smaller. Vivian was still across the tent. Mabel saw her register the ribbon, saw the moment Vivian understood that the outcome had not been what she'd arranged for or expected. The expression that crossed Vivian's face was not gracious, and she didn't try very hard to make it gracious. It was the expression of a woman absorbing a loss and deciding how to carry it in public. Then, because Vivian was not incapable of social calculation, even in difficult moments, she began to applaud. It was not warm, it was not enthusiastic, but it was visible, and it was public, and in a county where everyone was watching everyone, visible and public meant something. Mabel acknowledged it with a nod, a single unelaborate nod. Then she looked away. The ride back from the fair that evening was different from the ride home after the charitable supper. Then both of them had been carrying things they weren't ready to put down. Now the air between them was lighter in the particular way of a day that went the way it should, not perfectly, not without complication, but with the outcome that the work deserved, and that was its own kind of peace. The hands rode back ahead of them. Burl and Denny had gone in the supply wagon, and Harlan had taken his own horse, and Silas and Mabel were alone in the buggy on the September road, with the late afternoon light going gold across the prairie and the blue ribbon folded in Mabel's bag. Eleanor Marsh stopped me on the way out, Silas said. Mabel looked at him, and she said he paused with the hint of expression that meant he was choosing whether to be amused and deciding. Yes, she said she hoped you'd enter the jam category next year as well, because she expected it would be equally instructive. Mabel considered this, instructive, her word. That's an interesting compliment. From Eleanor Marsh, it's an extraordinary compliment. He looked at her sideways. She also said Vivian's quince entry was technically accomplished and lacked soul. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she didn't say that. She said something very close to it. I'm paraphrasing slightly. What exactly did she say? She said the quince showed considerable attention to presentation and insufficient attention to flavor. which in Eleanor Marsh's vocabulary means the same thing as lacking soul, but with more precision. Mabel sat with this for a moment, then she laughed. Not the careful laugh she deployed in social situations, the real one, the one that came from somewhere unexpected and didn't have time to be polite about itself. She laughed, and Silas watched her laugh, with an expression that she would have liked to see with more frequency, the expression of a man who has caused something genuinely good to happen in the world and knows it. "That's going to make Vivian furious," she said when she got her breath back. "Probably. Good." He laughed then too, quiet but real. And the buggy rolled on through the September evening, with the blue ribbon in her bag, and the ranch ahead of them, and the space between them on the seat, the comfortable distance of people who have stopped being careful about how close they're sitting. The evening settled over the ranch in the gradual way of September evenings, the light going long and amber, the air cooling, the particular quiet of a working property at the end of a day that had not been a working day. The hands were back in the bunkhouse. The livestock were settled. The barn stood solid against the early dark, its repaired roof indistinguishable from the original, except that it was, if anything, slightly stronger. Mabel made supper from what was in the kitchen. Simple food, nothing elaborate. She was tired in the good way, and wanted something that required presence rather than effort. She made a hash from the leftover roast and fresh eggs, and the last of the summer onions, cooked everything together in the cast-iron skillet until the edges crisped, seasoned it correctly, put it on the table. Silas ate at the kitchen table rather than the front room, which had become the habit on evenings when it was just the two of them. They ate without much conversation, and it wasn't empty. It was the quiet of two people who had been in the same day together and didn't need to narrate it back to each other. After supper, while she was washing up, he said, "I want to show you something." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Now, when you're done." She finished the washing and dried her hands and followed him out the back of the house through the small door she'd rarely used, into the back portion of the property she'd seen only from a distance. The garden was there. She had known about it. In the abstract, Denny had mentioned once, obliquely, that there'd been a garden back here that the first Mrs. Boone had kept, but she'd never had reason to go back, and Silas had never brought her, and she'd let it be the part of the property that wasn't hers to involve herself with. In the early dark, she could make out the shape of it, not large, perhaps 30 feet across, enclosed by a low fence that had been built with care. Plants inside were mostly gone to their end-of-season forms, the dried stalks of summer things, the brown remains of what had been growing. But there were perennials that would come back. She could see them even in the dim light, the low-mounded shapes of plants that had survived more than one season and would survive more still. And along the south side, new growth, not dried stalks. Green things, still holding, plants that had been put in more recently. She crouched and looked at them more closely and recognized lavender and sage and what she thought might be rosemary. Small plants that hadn't had the summer to establish fully, but had rooted. "Planted these," she said, "in July." He was standing behind her, hands in his pockets. "The old plants are Eleanor's, my first wife's. I left them because I don't know. They survived without attention, and it seemed wrong to pull them." He paused. "I put the new ones in, the herbs. I thought—" He stopped. "The kitchen. I thought you could use them." She stood up. She looked at the garden in the dark, the old plants and the new ones, the things that had survived and the things that had been started fresh, all of it existing in the same space without canceling each other out. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I wasn't sure what it meant when I did it." He looked at the garden rather than at her. "I think I was starting to understand something, and I wasn't ready to say it out loud." She waited. "I put the advertisement in the paper because the ranch needed someone to cook," he said. "That was true, and I'm not going to pretend it was more than that at the start." He paused. "But I planted rosemary for a woman I was starting to want to keep, and those are not the same thing." The night was very still. An owl moved somewhere beyond the fence, the soft sound of wings in dark air, and was gone. "Silas," she said. "I know it's he started, Silas." She said his name again, quieter. "I know," he looked at her. "I knew before you did," she said. "Been watching you figure it out for 3 months and waiting for you to get there." She said it without cruelty, just as a fact that she'd been carrying. "You're not a fast mover." He absorbed this. "No," he agreed. "That's all right." She looked at the garden again, at the lavender and the sage and the small rosemary plants putting their roots into the same ground as the things that had been there before them. "I'm not in a hurry." He reached out and took her hand. Not the way he'd held it under the table at the supper, which had been sudden and instinctive and slightly startled on both sides. This was deliberate, considered. The action of a man who knew what he was doing and meant it. She let her fingers close around his. "The preserve is exceptional," he said, in case Eleanor Marsh's opinion wasn't sufficient. "It isn't that I need more opinions. I know, I just wanted to say it." He paused. "You built something in this kitchen. You built it from worse than nothing. And every person who tasted that preserve today tasted what you built, and they knew it was real." He looked at her. "I knew it was real the first morning, before anyone else did." She thought about that first breakfast, the sourdough she hadn't made yet, the biscuits she'd made from a stove she hadn't finished cleaning, the 20 men eating in silence because the food was too good to interrupt with words. She thought about Harlan Pike bringing his plate back to the kitchen for the first time in 3 years. She thought about 6 days of work in a ruined kitchen, and a shelf rebuilt from sound wood, and the specific satisfaction of a window that sealed. "You said you'd get the lumber," she said, "that first day. I told you what I needed, and you said you'd send Denny to town." She looked at him. Most men would have argued, or waited to see if I was serious. "You were clearly serious, I know. But you couldn't have known that yet." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew you weren't going to cook in a kitchen that was falling apart. That was obvious." He paused. "I also knew that a woman who refused to start without the right conditions was a woman who was going to do something worth watching." The garden was very still around them, the old plants and the new, the survived and the newly started. Mabel stood in the September dark with the blue ribbon in her bag and her hand in her husband's, and thought about what it meant to be seen before you'd proven anything to be taken seriously, before the proof arrived, and how rarely that had happened to her, and how much it turned out to matter. "The rosemary will establish by spring," she said. "Expect so. I'll plant more along the east side. Kitchen faces east. It'll be close enough to cut from." "Whatever you need," he said. She looked at him. The last of the September light was gone now, and his face was dim in the early dark, but she knew it well enough by now that the dark didn't change it, the careful eyes, the mouth that said less than it meant, the patient face of a man who had learned to wait for things worth waiting for. "I think," she said, "that we're going to be all right." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Then I think so too." It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a resolution. It was two people standing in a garden in the dark, holding hands, having come a long way from a newspaper advertisement, and a ruined kitchen, and an arrangement that was supposed to be simple and had turned out to be something else entirely. It was enough, more than enough. The stars came out above the Boone ranch, and the garden was quiet around them. And in the kitchen, the blue ribbon lay in her bag on the work table, and September settled into the land like something that intended to stay. The rosemary was still small when October came in, but it had rooted. Mabel checked it every morning on her way back from the barn with the milk pail, a quick detour through the garden gate, a look at the new plantings along the east side, a touch of her fingers to the soil to check the moisture. The lavender had gone slightly woody at the base, the way lavender did in autumn, which meant it was settling in rather than failing, and the sage had spread enough that she'd had to thin it once already. The rosemary was the slowest, as rosemary always was, but the color in the needles was right and the stems weren't soft, which meant the roots were doing their work underground, where no one could see them. She understood something about that. October on the frontier had its own particular character, not the dramatic death of things, but the quieting, the way the land pulled its energy inward and down, conserving for the long cold that was coming. The mornings were sharp now, the first frost having arrived in the last week of September, and settled the question of summer conclusively. Kitchen was warmer than anywhere else on the ranch, from 4 in the morning until 9 at night, which meant it had become, more than before, the place where people gathered when they needed to be somewhere that felt inhabited. Silas was there most mornings now without pretense. He had stopped treating his presence in the kitchens as something that required justification. The coffee, the practical question, the reason for stopping, and simply came, the way a person comes to a room in their own house, because it's where they want to be. He sat at the work table with whatever he was working through, a ledger, a letter, a problem about the herd rotation he needed to think out loud, and Mabel moved around him, the way she moved around everything in that kitchen, efficiently, without resentment, making space where space was needed. It was domestic in the plainest sense of the word, and she had not expected to find that word so satisfying. The blue ribbon hung on the wall beside the pantry. She'd put it there herself, on a small nail she'd driven into the log with one clean strike the morning after the fair. Silas had seen it and said nothing, and she'd seen him see it and say nothing, and they had both understood that was the right response. The ribbon wasn't there to make a point to visitors. It was there because she had earned it, and this was her kitchen, and she was allowed to hang things in it. What the fair had changed was not anything dramatic. The county didn't transform overnight. The women who had crossed the street to avoid her didn't suddenly reverse course or arrive with casseroles. Vivian Harcourt did not repent or reform. The social architecture of Coldwater was what it had always been: layered, historical, slow to shift, and a preserved competition result, however well-deserved, didn't rewrite it. What it changed was smaller and realer than that. People tasted the preserve. That was the thing. Eleanor Marsh had said the balance was exceptional, and Eleanor Marsh's opinion was known and respected, and the jar of sour cherry preserve that had sat on the judging table, with a blue ribbon beside it, had been tasted by perhaps 40 people over the course of the fair afternoon. Word of something genuinely good travels in a small county, the way all true things travel, not with fanfare, but with the persistent authority of first-hand experience. By the second week of October, Mabel had received 3 requests for preserves from women in the county who wanted to purchase jars for their own households. She had 14 jars remaining on the shelf, and she sold 9 of them, at a price she set herself, to women who came to the ranch door and asked politely and did not comment on anything except the preserves. She told Silas about the sales at supper one evening. He looked up from his plate. "How much did you sell them for?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair price." "I thought so. You could charge more, I know. But I want them to come back next year, and they will if the price was fair." She cut her meat. "Also, I want to plant more cherry trees in the spring. I'm selling preserves. The orchard should earn its keep." He looked at her with the expression she'd learned. Was his version of being impressed not demonstrative, just a quality of attention that sharpened. "You're thinking about this like a business." "It is a business. Small one, but still, the ranch could support it. Land along the east fence has decent drainage for fruit trees." He paused. "I can have Harlan mark out the section in the spring. I'll mark it myself. I know what I want." "I know you do," he said, without irony, and went back to his supper. She sat with that for a moment, the easy acceptance of it, the complete absence of argument or condescension, the way he said, "I know you do," as though it were simply true, and required no further commentary. She had spent so many years in situations where her competence was either doubted or resented that the straightforward acknowledgement of it still caught her occasionally by surprise. She was working on accepting it as normal. She thought she might get there eventually. The letter from her brother Thomas arrived on a Wednesday in mid-October, forwarded through the Coldwater Post from the Missouri address where she'd last written him. She read it in the kitchen before the morning was fully started, standing at the work table, with the paper in her hands and the fire just beginning to take in the stove. Thomas wrote the way he'd always written, practically, without embellishment, the writing of a man who considered words a tool rather than an indulgence. He said the money she'd sent had covered the worst of the debt. He said the farm was holding. He said their younger sister May had started work at the dry goods store in town and was managing. He said he hoped she was well. At the end, in a postscript that looked slightly different from the rest of the letter, as though he'd come back to add it after folding the page, "I heard you won something at the county fair. The woman at the post office mentioned it. I'm glad." She read the postscript twice. Then she sat down at the work table, which she rarely did during working hours, and sat with the letter in her hands for a few minutes. She thought about the family she'd left in Missouri. Thomas, with his practical letters and his stubborn insistence on managing the debt himself until it got bad enough that he couldn't. May, who was 17, and had her mother's eyes and their father's determination. The farm that was still standing when all the arithmetic of it said it probably shouldn't be. She thought about the advertisement she'd answered, and the train fare she'd taken, and the particular morning she'd stepped off the platform in Coldwater, carrying a canvas bag and 43 cents, and the knowledge that she was doing what needed to be done. She had not expected to end up here. She had not expected the kitchen, or the garden, or the blue ribbon on the wall, or the man who planted rosemary in July, because he was starting to understand something he wasn't ready to say out loud. She had not expected to feel at home. She wrote Thomas back that afternoon, between the noon meal and supper preparations. She told him the farm was right to hold. She told him she was well. She told him the ranch had good land and the work suited her, and she was putting up an orchard in the spring. She told him to tell May that the dry goods work was good, honest work, and to take it seriously. At the end she wrote, "I think I am happy. I wasn't sure that was going to be possible when I left. I wanted you to know." She sealed the envelope and gave it to Denny for the next mail run, and went back to the kitchen and did not think about it further. Because thinking about it further would have required examining feelings she was still in the process of understanding. And there was supper to make. The first snow came in November, a real snow, not the tentative flurry of late October, but the kind that arrived with conviction and intended to stay. Mabel woke to it on a Tuesday morning, the particular quality of light through her window that meant white outside, the silence that snow imposed on a landscape, the cold that had found its way into the room despite the banked fire. She built the kitchen fire up before anything else. This was non-negotiable. 20 men needed to eat, and the cold made the eating more important, not less, and a kitchen that was warm when the rest of the world was frozen was a specific and practical mercy. The ranch operated differently in winter. The pace wasn't slower exactly. Cattle didn't slow down, but the quality of the work changed, became more about endurance and less about momentum. The hands spent more time at the barn and less time on the open range. The days were shorter. The bunkhouse fire ran constantly. People moved with the particular economy of those who understood that warmth was a resource to be managed. Mabel managed warmth in the kitchen the way she managed everything, systematically, without waste, with the satisfaction of a person whose competence and environment were well matched. She had put up enough stores in October to carry the ranch through a hard winter. She'd been deliberate about it, making her lists and working through them the way her mother had taught her, salting and smoking and drying and putting up in jars everything that the summer and fall had offered. Pantry shelves, rebuilt by her own hands on her first week and reinforced twice since, held their weight easily. Silas looked at the pantry one November evening and was quiet for a moment. "We've never gone into winter this prepared," he said. "I know. I could tell when I inventoried it in September." She was checking the lower shelves. There were gaps. Things that should have been put up and weren't. Eleanor hadn't been well the last winter before He stopped. Mabel straightened and looked at him. He was looking at the pantry shelves with the expression he sometimes got when he ran up against the history of this place, not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something more complicated, feeling of a life that had continued after a loss and carried the loss with it. "You don't have to not say her name," Mabel said. He looked at her. "Eleanor, your first wife," she said it plainly. "You can talk about her. This isn't a competition with someone who's gone." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know that, do you? Because you stop yourself." She leaned against the shelf. "I've noticed." He looked at the pantry for another moment. Then he said she was a good woman. She was sick for almost a year before she died, and she kept trying to manage the ranch through it, and she shouldn't have. She should have rested, but that wasn't in her nature, and he stopped again. "I let her push herself because it was easier than arguing with her. And after, I wasn't sure whether I was grieving her or feeling guilty or both." "Probably both," Mabel said. "That's how those things work." He looked at her. "I didn't know her," she said, "but the garden she kept is still alive, and the house she built is solid. And you ran this ranch for 3 years in a way that kept 20 men employed even when the heart had gone out of it." She paused. "That sounds like a man who was doing his best with a hard thing, not a man who did something wrong." The pantry was warm and dim and smelled of dried herbs and cured meat and the particular close smell of a well-stocked winter larder. "You're easier to talk to than I expected," Silas said. "I know." She pushed off the shelf and went back to her inventory. "Most people find that surprising. Why?" "Because I'm not soft about it." She counted the salt pork. "I don't comfort people in the way that sounds like comfort. I just say what I think is true. That's what's easy about it." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor used to say that comfort that isn't true isn't comfort. It's just noise." Mabel paused in her counting. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," she said. Silas looked at her. The expression on his face was something she'd never seen there before. Not quite grief, not quite gratitude. Something that moved between the two and carried the weight of both. "I think so too," he said. The winter settled in, and the ranch settled into winter, and the days developed the rhythm that cold imposes on working places, the early dark, the long evenings, the gathering of people around sources of warmth, both literal and otherwise. Harlan Pike started eating breakfast in the kitchen rather than the bunkhouse on the coldest mornings, which he presented not as a preference but as a proximity decision. Kitchen was closer to the barn. This was technically true and not the actual reason, and everyone understood that and said nothing, because Harlan had earned the right to his own fictions. Denny Alcott, emboldened by months of proximity and the lowered social inhibitions of winter, started occasionally sitting at the kitchen table after the morning meal and talking. Not about anything in particular, about the horse he was hoping to break in the spring, about a letter he'd received from his family in Kansas, about whether the snow this year seemed heavier than last year. Question no one could definitively answer, but everyone had opinions about. Mabel's listened while she worked and answered. when she had something to add and didn't when she didn't, which was the arrangement Denny found most comfortable because it meant he could talk without worrying about whether it was welcome. Burl continued to bring wood. He had apparently decided this was a permanent condition of his life, and no further discussion was required. On a Thursday evening in December, when the temperature had dropped to something that made the windows on the north side of the house run with condensation on the inside, Mabel made a pie. Not a supper pie, not something practical. Just a pie, a dried apple pie with a lattice crust and cinnamon, and a small amount of the brown sugar she'd been rationing since October. She made it in the late afternoon for no reason, except that she felt like it, which was not a justification she'd often allowed herself. Things were made because they were needed, in her experience. Making something just because you wanted to was a luxury she'd categorized as not applicable. She was revising that categorization. The pie came out of the oven at 6, and she put it on the work table to cool. And the smell of it went through the ranch house, and apparently through the walls, because Denny appeared at the kitchen door within 10 minutes with the expression of a man who had been drawn somewhere by forces outside his control. "Is that?" she said. "Come back in an hour." He retreated. She heard him in the yard telling Burl. When she sliced the pie an hour later, she cut 8 slices, put them on plates, and sent them to the bunkhouse with Denny. Kept 2 and set 1 in front of Silas at the kitchen table, and sat down across from him with the other. He looked at the pie. He looked at her. He said, "You made pie." "I wanted to make pie. Just because? Is that unusual?" He considered it. "For you a little. I'm expanding my range," she said. He ate the pie without further commentary. She watched him eat it with the particular satisfaction of a cook who knows the thing is good and watches someone discover it in real time. His expression went through 3 stages: expectation, surprise, and then the quiet settling, eating something that has met and exceeded what they hoped for. "Mabel's," he said when he'd finished. "Don't say it's the best pie you've ever had. I know it's good. I don't need the superlative." He looked at her with the hint of something around his eyes. "I was going to ask why you're sitting, 'cause I wanted to." She looked at her own plate. "I'm practicing sitting down for things I'm allowed to enjoy." He was quiet for a moment. "How's that going?" "It's harder than it looks." She ate a bite of the pie. "I keep thinking about what else should be done." "There'll always be something else that should be done." "I know, you've earned a piece of pie and a chair," he said. "The ranch will still be here when you're done." She looked at him across the table, this man who had advertised for a cook and gotten something considerably more complicated, who had planted rosemary in July, and said, "I know you do," without needing to be asked, who had stood up in a room full of people and said true things clearly and loudly enough for everyone to hear. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the train in April with 43 cents in her coat pocket and the knowledge that she was doing what needed to be done. That woman had not imagined this kitchen, this table, this pie, this man across from her eating it with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated pleasure. That woman had been aiming for adequate and had landed somewhere better than she'd known how to plan for. "Silas," she said, "I need to tell you something that I've been—" She stopped, steadied. "That I've been not telling you, 'cause the right moment kept not arriving, and eventually I decided the right moment was a thing I was going to have to create rather than wait for." He set his fork down and looked at her with the full quality of his attention. "I love you," she said, plainly the way she said things. "I don't know exactly when it started. Somewhere between the shelf brackets and the barn roof, probably. Maybe before. I've been careful about it, because I came here as a practical arrangement, and I didn't want to presume that the arrangement had become something else just because it felt that way to me." She paused. "But I think I've been waiting long enough." The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside, the winter pressed against the windows with the patience of weather that isn't going anywhere. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The shelf brackets. What about them?" That's when I knew. He looked at the table, then back at her. "You held that bracket against the block and told me the exact angle and drove the nail without hesitating. And the bracket was solid. And you said good and went back to work. And I stood there thinking." He stopped. "Tried again. Thinking that I hadn't felt useful in 3 years, and you just made me feel useful in 4 minutes without making anything of it." He paused. "I didn't know what that meant yet. But that was when." She was quiet. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I know that. I close up when things are difficult. I say less than I should, and then don't say the rest of it for too long. I've made you guess at things you shouldn't have had to guess at." "You're improving," she said. "I know. You're not particularly patient with the parts that need improving." "No, I'm not." She looked at him directly. "I don't think patience is always kindness." Sometimes it just lets things stay the way they are. No, he agreed. You push. He said it without complaint as a fact. You push and you fix things and you tell the truth, whether or not the room is ready for it. He picked up his fork again, then put it back down. Mabel, I told you in the garden that I planted rosemary because I wanted to keep you. That was the most I knew how to say then. He paused. What I mean is what I want is I choose you. Not the cook. Not the woman the ranch needs, you. He paused once more, and she could see him working through his own inadequacy with words which was real and not performed. I'm not good at this. You're getting better, she said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The same hand she'd held under the table at the charitable supper. The same hand that had closed around hers in the garden in September. It was a rancher's hand, scarred and strong and slightly rough. And she knew it now the way she knew the kitchen, the way she knew the shelf she'd built, and the window she'd sealed, by the accumulated familiarity of presence and work and time. I love you, she said again, and I want you to know that I'm not saying it because I need something from you. I'm saying it because it's true and true things should be said. He turned his hand over and held hers. I love you, he said. He said it like it cost him something, and he'd decided the cost was worth it. He shook his head slightly. I've been a slow learner about this. I told you that in September. You did the hint of expression around his eyes. You weren't wrong. I'm usually not. I know. He said it the way he always said it, I know, as a complete sentence, as a form of respect that she had come to trust, precisely because it never wavered. I know you're not. The winter passed the way good winters do on a working ranch, hard in the way that is also clarifying, cold in the way that makes warmth something worth tending. Kitchen held its warmth. The pantry held its stores. The horses made it through without loss. The cattle made it through with acceptable loss, which was the frontier version of success, and Silas said so without pretending the acceptable losses hadn't been losses. In March, when the ground softened enough to work, Mabel marked out the section of land along the east fence for the orchard. She did it herself, as she told Silas she would, with stakes and a line, and the methodical patience of a woman, planning something intended to outlast her. 12 trees in the first planting, 8 cherry, 2 plum, 2 apple set in rows, with enough space between them to grow properly and allow for harvest. Harlan watched her mark it out and said nothing, which was his form of approval. Silas helped her plant them. He did it without being asked, which was how he did most things now, showing up to the work and picking up whatever end needed, picking up and doing it without requiring direction or recognition. They worked down the rows together in the early April mud, setting the young trees in the holes Burl had dug, firming the soil around the roots, staking the smaller ones against the spring wind. It was dirty work and slow, and nothing about it was graceful. Mabel's boots were soaked through by mid-morning, and her back ached by early afternoon, and she got mud on her face at one point, reaching past a tree stake, and Silas noticed and said nothing about it for 10 minutes, and then said, "You haven't," gestured at his own cheek. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, which was also muddy, and accomplished nothing. He watched this, and then, without comment, reached over and wiped the mud off her cheek with his thumb, matter-of-factly, the way you'd do it for someone you'd been working beside for a year and intended to go on working beside. She looked at him. He looked back. "Thank you," she said. He said, and went back to the tree he was staking. She stood in the April mud between 2 young cherry trees and felt something that she'd spent most of her adult life, not allowing herself to feel with any reliability, the simple, unqualified rightness of being exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing with exactly this person. Not because she'd earned it through suffering, not because she'd finally become acceptable to someone, just because she'd done the work and told the truth, and refused to apologize for who she was, and this was where that had led. It had led to mud on her face and an orchard that wouldn't fruit for 3 years, and a man who wiped the mud off without making it into anything. It had led home. The county fair came again in September, as it always did, and Mabel entered the preserves competition again, as she had decided she would, with 3 jars of the cherry, preserved from the trees she'd tended through their first full summer, on the property, not the new orchard. Those were still too young, but the original trees on the east edge of the ranch that she'd found in her second week and had been tending properly since. She also entered a category she hadn't entered the year before, the plum butter, which she'd been developing through the summer, with the methodical approach she brought to everything, adjusting the spice balance and the cook time until she found the version that was exactly what she intended. Eleanor Marsh was head judge again. Vivian Harcourt entered the competition again, with a different preserve a fig variety that required imported fruit and demonstrated, As Denny put it with his talent for understatement, a lot of effort. Mabel entered her jars on Thursday afternoon and walked away and didn't think about them until Friday. She won the cherry preserve again. The plum butter took second in its category, behind a genuinely exceptional entry from a woman in the northern part of the county whom Mabel had never met and whose name she learned from the ribbon and whose preserve she tasted at the judging table and found, honestly, excellent, not quite as good as her own. But close enough that second was correct, and she said so. To Silas, on the ride home. You said her preserve was close to yours, he said. It was. That doesn't bother you. Why would it? She made something good. That doesn't diminish what I made. She looked at the road ahead. Competition isn't a fixed amount of excellence. More than one person can be excellent. He was quiet for a moment. You should tell Denny that. He's been convinced, since last year, that you're the only person in the county capable of preserving anything. Denny is enthusiastic and not always accurate. No, the hint of a smile. But he means it. What Mabel had not expected, and what turned out to be the thing that changed the county's understanding of her most permanently, was not the second fair ribbon or the orchard or the preserves sold to neighboring households. It was the Tuesday in October when Clara Sturch, the rancher's wife, who had crossed the street to avoid her in August of the previous year, appeared at the ranch kitchen door with a bowl of preserving cherries she'd picked too late in the seasons, and didn't know what to do with, and asked, with the particular difficulty of a woman, asking for something she should have offered friendship, instead of requiring it, whether Mabel might have any advice. Mabel looked at the bowl of late cherries. She looked at Clara Sturch, who was perhaps 50, and had the tired face of a woman who had worked hard her whole life, and occasionally been unkind when she was afraid and knew it. Come in, Mabel said. I'll put coffee on. She taught Clara Sturch to make a late-season cherry preserve that accounted for the lower sugar content of overripe fruit. Clara Sturch sat at the kitchen work table and watched and asked questions and answered questions, honestly when Mabel asked them back. And by the time the jars were sealed and cooling, the afternoon had done what afternoons sometimes do when two people stop performing and start talking. It had become real. Clara Sturch, leaving with her 4 jars of finished preserve, paused at the kitchen door. I wasn't kind to you, she said. Last year, I let Vivian Harcourt tell me what to think about you before I'd thought about it myself. She looked at her jars. That was wrong. Mabel had heard apologies before. Most of them were about the person giving them, about their own need to feel clean of something. This one seemed to be about something else, which was rarer. All right, Mabel said. Come back in the spring. I'm putting in a proper herb bed, and I'll need someone to help me thin the seedlings. Clarissa Sturch looked at her. Just like that? Life's too long to hold everything, Mabel said, and too short to waste Thursday afternoons on it. Clara Sturch laughed, not the polished laugh of county social events, but the real one, and left. Mabel watched her go, and then turned back to her kitchen and looked at it. The shelf she'd built on her first week, solid and plumb, and carrying its weight without complaint. Stove she'd cleaned back to the iron, still drawing correctly. The window she'd sealed, still tight against the weather. Pantry shelves full, the blue ribbon on the wall. The small pot of rosemary on the sill that she'd moved inside for the winter. The plant itself leggy now, and needing pruning, which she'd do on Saturday. She thought about the woman who had arrived in April, a year and a half ago, carrying a canvas bag and a wooden trunk and 43 cents, who had stood in this ruined kitchen and said, I won't cook in a kitchen that's falling apart, who had not known then whether that refusal would cost her everything she'd come for. It had not cost her anything. It had been the first true thing she'd said in this place, and the true things had accumulated from there. And this was where accumulation had brought her. She was not a different person than she had been. She was not thinner or prettier or more socially acceptable or softer at the edges or more willing to make herself smaller than the space she occupied. She was exactly who she had been: stubborn, competent, direct, bad at waiting, good at work, better than she'd expected to be at loving someone and being loved back. What had changed was not her. What had changed was the space around her, the way it had expanded to fit who she actually was, instead of contracting to fit who she was supposed to be. That was worth something. That was worth a great deal. That evening, Silas came to the kitchen before supper and stood in the doorway, in the way he'd stood on that first day, looking at the room, taking it in, but the look was completely different from what it had been. Then he'd been assessing a problem. Now, he was looking at something that was his and hers and theirs, in the complicated, unspoken way that things become shared between people who have built a life in the same space over the same time. Clara Sturch was, he said. She came to see you. Came for help with preserves. Mabel stirred the pot on the stove. We talked. He looked at her. Is it settled, whatever was between you? It was never very complicated between us. It was complicated between her and Vivian, and she let that become complicated between her and me. She paused. But yes, it's settled. He nodded, satisfied. He came into the kitchen and sat at the work table. I have something for you, he said. She looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small iron key, not new, worn from use, the kind of key that had been handled for years and had the warmth of it. Pantry key, he said. There's only one. I've had it since the pantry was built. He set it on the table between them. I want you to have it. Not because the ranch needs someone to manage the stores. Not because 20 men need feeding. Because he paused, and she could see him finding the words with the deliberate care of a man who had been practicing saying more than the minimum. Because this is your kitchen, and your pantry, and your ranch, as much as it's mine. And I want you to have the key to it the way I have the key to it. Not as the cook, as my wife, as the person this place belongs to. She looked at the key on the table. She had rebuilt the pantry shelf herself. She had filled the pantry herself. She had stood in that pantry in November and talked to Silas about his first wife and watched something in him ease that had been held tight for 3 years. Picked up the key. It was heavier than she expected. The way iron always was denser than it looked, warmer from being in his pocket. Thank you, she said. It's yours, I know. She closed her hand around it. That's what I'm thanking you for. He looked at her with the expression that was still, after all this time, the one she found hardest to look at directly, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was so thoroughly what she'd spent most of her life not believing she was allowed to receive. It was the expression of a person seeing her entirely, without reduction, without the preliminary of deciding what she should be before registering what she was. She looked back at him anyway. She had been practicing that too. I don't want to be needed anymore, she said. Just to be clear, I want to be chosen. I know. I'm choosing you too. I know that also. The hint of expression. You've been choosing me since July. The last to figure it out. You were, she agreed. Outside, the October afternoon was going to evening. The light doing what it did in autumn, going gold and sideways across the land, making everything look slightly more significant than it did at noon, which she had come to appreciate as one of the frontier's underrated qualities. Kitchen was warm. The pantry was full. Orchard was in the ground. The rosemary on the sill was leggy and needed pruning, and was absolutely, stubbornly still alive. Some things you had to be patient about. Not passive, not sitting on a cot in the dark, waiting for the world to decide to treat you fairly but patient in the way of someone who keeps working and telling the truth and refusing to let other people's limitations become her own, and trusting that the accumulation of true things eventually builds something that lasts. She had arrived in Coldwater County as the woman everyone underestimated. She had stayed as the woman who fed the ranch, and sealed the window, and planted the orchard, and made the preserve that Eleanor Marsh said showed the work, and told Vivian Harcourt the truth to her face, and taught Clara Sturch to salvage late cherries, and loved a closed-off man until he learned to open without being forced. The gossip had not disappeared. Vivian Harcourt had not transformed into someone generous. The county had not become a place without judgment. People were people, and small towns were small towns, and none of that was going to change, because one woman had made an exceptional preserve and hung a blue ribbon on her kitchen wall. Kitchen was hers. The key was in her hand. The orchard was in the ground, and the man at the work table was looking at her the way she'd needed, for most of her life, to be looked at as if she were exactly enough, exactly as she was, without revision or apology. She turned back to the stove and stirred the pot and thought, this is the thing they never tell you about hard work and stubborn honesty. Not that they guarantee the outcome they don't. Not that they protect you from cruelty or unfairness or the specific exhaustion of being underestimated in public by people who have decided not to look closely. What they give you is this, the knowledge that what you built is real, and what you said was true, and who you are was yours the whole time, and nobody no gossip, no social architecture. No woman with a perfectly etched jar label and imported quints can take back the work you did with your own hands in the room where you decided to stay. Mabel Hart had come to a broken ranch. She had fixed what was broken and stayed. She was still here, and the kitchen that had been falling apart on the day she arrived was, on this October evening, the warmest room in the house and the heart of everything that had grown up around it.